The first snow of the season had not yet fallen, but the cold had already arrived in Black Hollow the way it always did. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, like a fist pressed flat against the chest of every man, woman, and child who had ever been foolish enough to call this place home. It came in the gray before dawn, crept through the gaps in poorly mortared walls, settled into the straw of sleeping pallets, and made itself comfortable in the bones of anyone who hadn't managed to store enough firewood before the end of harvest. In Black Hollow, survival was not a birthright. It was something you fought for every single day, with bleeding hands and a jaw clenched so tight your teeth ached. Elena Whitmore had been fighting that fight her entire life. She was 27 years old, and in a village where most women her age had already buried at least one child and were well into raising two more, she was considered, depending on who you asked, either tragically unmarried or mercifully unattached. Her hands were rough from years of mending other people's fences and hauling water from the creek that ran half a mile east of her family's crumbling property. Her dark hair was usually pulled back with a strip of leather because she had learned long ago that loose hair and farm tools were a dangerous combination. Her eyes were the color of river water in autumn, neither quite green nor quite brown, and they had a particular quality to them that made people uncomfortable if they held the gaze too long, not because they were cold, but because they were clear, unnervingly, unflinchingly clear, in a way that suggested Elena Whitmore saw things precisely as they were and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. This quality had never made her popular. "Elena," her mother's voice cut through the morning like a blade through thin cloth. Marta Whitmore stood in the doorway of the main house, arms crossed over her wide chest, expression arranged into the particular configuration it always took when she was about to say something cruel and wanted to make sure it landed with maximum impact. "The Caldwell boy came by yesterday while you were out patching the roof." Elena set down the bucket she was carrying and straightened slowly. "Did he?" "He's looking for a wife." "I'm aware of what Thomas Caldwell is looking for." "Then you ought to be grateful he's still looking in your direction." Marta stepped down off the porch, her heavy boots making the wooden steps groan. "You're not getting younger, you're not getting prettier, and you're certainly not getting any richer. A woman in your position doesn't have the luxury of being particular." Elena picked up the bucket again. "Elena, are you listening to me?" "Every word, Mama." She walked toward the barn. Behind her, she heard her mother make the sound, that particular exhale, halfway between a sigh and a grunt, that had been Marta Whitmore's primary method of communication for as long as Elena could remember. It meant, "You are a disappointment." It meant, "You were a mistake." It meant, "I carried you and fed you, and this is what I get." Elena had stopped letting it break her sometime around her 15th year. Now it simply passed through her like wind through a gap in a fence. Present, felt, ultimately meaningless. The barn was in better shape than the house. Elena had made sure of that. The two goats and the elderly ox that represented the entirety of the Whitmore livestock needed shelter that didn't leak. And unlike the house, right, which her mother refused to let Elena touch because it had been her husband's house and would remain exactly as he'd left it, even as it slowly returned to earth, the barn was Elena's domain. She had re-timbered the east wall herself 3 summers ago. She had replaced the roof shingles last spring, trading 2 weeks of labor at the Miller farm for the materials. She was feeding the goats when she heard footsteps in the doorway behind her. Not her mother's footsteps. Too light. Too deliberate. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He was standing just inside the threshold, hat in hand, the pale early light falling across the angular planes of his face in a way that, if Elena had been the kind of woman who let herself think such thoughts, she might have described as striking. He was tall, with the kind of lean, functional build that came from genuine labor rather than deliberate effort. His clothes were worn, but clean. His boots were the kind that had been resoled so many times, the original leather was almost entirely gone, replaced patch by patch with whatever material had been available. Rowan Hale had arrived in Black Hollow 3 months ago on a horse that looked nearly as tired as he did, with nothing to recommend him except a willingness to work and a manner so quiet it bordered on invisible. He had taken a room above the blacksmith's workshop, or rather, he had negotiated the use of the storage loft in exchange for helping with the forge work. and within 2 weeks he had become a fixture at the edges of village life. Always present, never intrusive. The kind of man people stopped noticing precisely because he was always there. "Mr. Hale," Elena said, "did you need something?" "I came to ask about the fence line," he said. "The eastern section, along the creek. I was out that way yesterday and I noticed 2 posts had shifted. The ground's been softening with all the rain we've had. If they go over before the freeze sets the soil again, you'll lose that section entirely come spring." Elena blinked. "I know about the posts." "I figured you did." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I also figured you probably don't have the time to get to them before the first hard frost." "What I have time for is my business." "Yes, ma'am." He nodded, without any indication of offense. "I'm offering to fix them. No charge. I can get it done in an afternoon if I start today." Elena studied him for a moment. This was not the first time Rowan Hale had appeared at the edge of her property with an offer to help. It had started 6 weeks ago, when he had noticed her struggling to move a fallen tree limb that had come down across the path to the creek after a storm. He had simply picked up the other end without being asked. When she'd thanked him, he'd nodded and walked away. Then he'd come back the next week to ask if the east wall of the barn was giving her trouble, because he'd noticed it from the road, and it looked like it might need some support before winter. Then, the week after that, he'd left a bundle of dried herbs on the porch, the kind that were good for treating the cough the older goat had developed, with a note that said only in case it helps. Elena did not know what to make of Rowan Hale. She had spent a considerable amount of time trying to determine what he wanted, because in her experience, people who offered things without an obvious price usually had a non-obvious one. But he had not asked for anything. He had not looked at her the way Thomas Caldwell looked at her, like she was a property transaction he was considering. He had not talked to her the way most people in Black Hollow talked to her, which was either with pity or with the particular dismissiveness reserved for people who were considered too inconvenient to engage with directly. He talked to her like she was a person worth talking to. It was, Elena had decided, deeply suspicious. "If you want to fix the fence posts," she said finally, "I won't stop you, but I'm not paying you." "I know. And I'm not cooking you a meal afterward or sitting by a fire with you, or any of the other things people in this village have apparently decided I'm desperate enough to do." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, not amusement. Something quieter than either of those things. "I know that too," he said. "I just want to fix the fence posts, Miss Whitmore. That's all." She held his gaze for another moment. Those eyes of his were strange, gray, or maybe a very pale green. It was hard to tell in this light. And they had the same quality she'd been told her own eyes had. That unsettling clarity, that sense of a person who was seeing something clearly and choosing their words accordingly. "Fine," she said. "The tools are in the corner." He fixed the fence posts. He was gone before she finished the evening chores. That was how it started. The village of Black Hollow had approximately 230 residents, which was more than enough people to ensure that nothing went unnoticed and absolutely nothing went uncommented upon. It was the kind of community that had survived for 3 generations on the frontier through a combination of collective stubbornness and collective gossip, and the latter had long since become indistinguishable from the former. People talked not because they were malicious, though some of them were, but because talking was how they processed the relentless harshness of frontier life. Sharing observations about neighbors was a way of feeling connected to something larger than the daily grind of survival. This did not make it any less brutal when you were the subject of it. "Saw the Hale man coming out of the Whitmore property again this morning," said Dorothy Marsh, loud enough to be heard by the 4 women standing around her at the market stalls on the first Thursday of November. "3rd time this week, by my count." "She's getting desperate, by gum," said Agnes Caldwell, Thomas's mother, whose interest in Elena's romantic prospects had been sharply negative ever since Elena had, in Agnes's view, inexplicably failed to be grateful enough for her son's attention. "Poor creature. You'd think she'd have more pride than to throw herself at a drifter." "He's not so bad to look at," offered young Petra Finch, who was 17 and hadn't yet developed the village's refined talent for cruelty. "Petra, he's not." "Looking is one thing," Dorothy said primly.
Letting a man with no name and no land and no prospects repair your fence posts is something else entirely. Mark my words. She'll be crying about it before winter's out. The conversation drifted, as it always did, through elaboration and embellishment and the quiet satisfaction of women who had managed to build lives that were, if not happy, at least conventionally structured. Elena heard none of it directly. She rarely went to the market on Thursdays, but she heard enough of the echoes, the pauses in conversations when she walked past, the glances exchanged over her head, to understand the shape of what was being said. She understood it. She had lived inside it long enough to know its dimensions precisely. What surprised her was that it had stopped hurting. The afternoon Rowan Hale sat across from her at her own kitchen table and told her about his horse was the afternoon Elena Whitmore began to understand that something was changing inside her. He'd come to ask about a loose roof shingle he'd noticed while passing on the road. Always noticing things, this man. Always finding something that needed to be fixed. And she had, without quite intending to, offered him tea. Not good tea. The scraping the bottom of the tin tea that tasted more like warm water with aspirations. But he had accepted it without comment, sat down at the table without ceremony, and somehow within 20 minutes they were talking. Not about the fence posts or the roof or the ways in which the Whitmore property was continuing its long argument with structural integrity. Talking about his horse. "Her name is Margot," he said. "I know, it's a ridiculous name for a horse. Where did it come from?" He looked at the cup in his hands for a moment. "She was given to me by a woman who was very kind to me at a time when I didn't deserve it. I named the horse after her because it was the only thing I could think to do." Elena wrapped her hands around her own cup. "What happened to the woman?" "She died." He said it simply, without drama, the way people said things they had long since made peace with. "A long time ago, before I came here." "I'm sorry." "So am I." The fire in the small hearth made the only sound in the kitchen for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. The particular northwest wind that meant the temperature would drop hard overnight. "Why did you come to Black Hollow?" Elena asked. It was the question she had been not asking for 6 weeks. "There's nothing here, no work worth having, no prospects. People come to places like this because they're running away from something, or they have nowhere else to go." Rowan looked at her. "Which category do you think I fall into?" "I think," Elena said carefully, "that you are not what you appear to be. And I think whatever reason you actually had for coming here, it wasn't the one you told Jeb Morrow at the blacksmith's when you took the loft." The silence that followed was different from the previous one, heavier, more considered. "You're very perceptive," Rowan said finally. "I've had a lot of practice watching people carefully." She met his gaze. "When you're the person everyone's always talking about, you learn to pay attention." Something moved in his expression, something she hadn't seen before. Not quite pain, but adjacent to it. The look of a person who had been watching from the outside long enough to know precisely what it felt like. "You deserve better than what this village gives you," he said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was not a line delivered with the intention of charm. It was a simple statement, delivered with the same direct clarity as everything else he said, and it landed somewhere in Elena's chest with a weight that took her breath for just a moment. She looked away first. "The shingle on the west side of the roof," she said. "I'll get the ladder if you want to take a look before you go." She did not let herself think about him in the way that the village was clearly already thinking about him in relation to her. She did not allow herself that particular vulnerability. She had made a practice, over the course of her 27 years, of not wanting things she couldn't have, because wanting them and not getting them was a particular kind of suffering she had decided she could do without. It was a useful discipline. It kept her functional. It kept her from ending up like her mother, who had wanted things. A husband who didn't drink, a farm that prospered, children who were grateful, and had gotten none of them, and had spent the decades since in a low continuous burn of resentment that had scorched everyone around her. Elena was not going to be her mother. But Rowan Hale kept showing up. He kept noticing things. He kept fixing them, or offering to fix them, or showing up with the right tool at the right moment with the specific quiet competence of a person who had spent a lot of time paying attention to the world around them. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. Actually listened,
Not the way people listened when they were waiting for a pause in which to insert themselves, but the way someone listened when they were genuinely interested in understanding. He never looked at her like she was a burden. He never looked at her like she was a transaction. He looked at her like she was interesting. It was, Elena thought, the most dangerous thing anyone had ever done to her. The conversation happened in November, on an evening when the first real snow had finally arrived, and Elena had found Rowan in the barn, checking on Margot, who had developed a slight lameness in her left foreleg. Elena had come to check on the goats. They had ended up sitting on opposite sides of the barn aisle, with the two goats and the old ox for witnesses. And somehow the conversation had spiraled from Margot's leg to the particular challenges of keeping animals healthy through a frontier winter, to the nature of the frontier itself, to what it meant to choose a life in a place like Black Hollow. "Did you choose it?" he asked. "Or were you just born here?" "Both," she said. "I was born here, and every year I choose to stay." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because leaving would mean admitting that they were right." "Who?" She gestured vaguely. "Everyone. The ones who've been saying my whole life that I'm nothing, that I have nothing, that I'm too stubborn and too difficult and too—" She stopped. "If I leave, it looks like running. And if I stay, I can at least be here to prove them wrong." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's a very long battle to fight alone." "Most worthwhile things are." He looked at her across the aisle. In the lamplight, his face was all shadow and angle, and his eyes had gone that gray-green color that she still couldn't quite name. "What if you didn't have to fight it alone?" Elena's hands stilled on the rope she'd been coiling. She looked back at him very steadily. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Hale?" He held her gaze. "I think you know." "I think," she said slowly, "that you should say it plainly." He nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "I think you are extraordinary," he said. "I think this village doesn't deserve you and doesn't understand you. I think you are the most capable and clear-eyed person I have met in a very long time. And I think," he paused, just briefly, "I think that if you were willing, I would like to be the person who stands beside you, permanently." The snow whispered against the barn walls. The old ox shifted in his stall. Elena stared at the man across from her and felt, somewhere deep inside the carefully maintained architecture of her practical and unromantic heart, something give way. A small thing. A single brick. But once it moved, she could feel the faint trembling of everything stacked above it. "You're serious," she said. "I am." "You have nothing. No land, no money, no name anyone in this village recognizes." "All true." "They'll say I've completely lost my mind." "Almost certainly." "My mother will—" She stopped. "I can't even begin to describe what my mother will do." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. All the practical arguments assembled themselves in her mind with the efficiency of long practice. The sensible objections, the careful calculations of risk and probability, and what this would mean for her position in a community that was already doing its best to grind her down. And underneath all of those, like bedrock under soil, the memory of the way he had listened, the way he had looked at her, the way he had said you deserve better and meant it without wanting anything in return. "All right," Elena Whitmore said. Yeah, they were married 3 weeks later in the most modest ceremony Black Hollow had ever witnessed. The traveling justice who came through twice a year, 2 signatures on a paper, and Elena in her best dress, which was not by any measure a particularly good dress, standing in the justice's cold sitting room with Rowan Hale beside her, and absolutely no one else present because Elena had not told anyone it was happening, and Rowan had no one to tell. It was, she would think later, the most honest moment of her life. The village found out on a Tuesday. It was not a secret that could be kept. In Black Hollow, no secret was. And Elena had known when she married him that the revelation would come with consequences. She had calculated those consequences in the practical, unsentimental way she calculated everything, and she had decided they were worth paying. She had not calculated precisely how public the payment would be. She was carrying water from the creek when Agnes Caldwell found her on the main road with 3 other women in tow, including Dorothy Marsh and, worst of all, Elena's own mother,
face set in that expression that suggested the temperature of her displeasure had exceeded what could be measured on any available scale. "Elena Whitmore," Agnes said. Loud, the way people spoke when they wanted an audience, and audiences were already beginning to materialize at doorways and windows along the road. "Is it true? Did you actually marry that vagrant?" Elena set down her water buckets very carefully. "His name is Rowan Hale," she said. And yes, the sound that went through the assembled women was something between a gasp and a groan, a noise of collective, satisfied horror. We knew it. We always knew she'd do something like this. "Elena," her mother's voice, lower than Agnes's, but somehow carrying more. "Look at me." Elena looked at her mother. Marta Whitmore's face was a geography of disappointment, carved over decades into something almost geological. "What have you done?" she said. Not a question. A verdict. "I got married," Elena said, "to a man who treats me well." "He treats you well." Marta repeated it the way you repeated something that had been said in a foreign language and you weren't sure you'd heard correctly. "He treats you well. He has nothing. He is nothing. He showed up here from nowhere, with nowhere to go back to. And you—" Her voice cracked, and Elena had the strange, disorienting experience of realizing that her mother was genuinely upset. Not performing it, actually feeling it. "You threw yourself at him like some desperate creature who'd given up on having any pride at all." The road had gone quiet. 20 people watching, maybe more. Windows open despite the cold. Children had stopped playing in the yard across the way and were watching with the unguarded fascination of those too young to understand that they were witnessing something that would become a story told for years. Elena felt the heat climb her neck, felt the familiar, exhausting weight of being publicly displayed like this, held up for inspection and found lacking, and felt, somewhere beneath that, the flicker of genuine hurt that she had never entirely managed to extinguish. Because it was her mother. Because no matter how many times you rebuilt the wall, the original damage was still there in the foundation. "He is my husband," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And I made my choice." "Your choice?" Agnes Caldwell stepped forward, her voice taking on that particular edge of gleeful malice. Listen to her, as if she had options, as if any decent man in this village was going to have her at 27 with nothing to her name and that attitude. "That's enough," the voice came from behind Elena. Everyone looked. Rowan Hale was standing 20 yards down the road. He had apparently come from the direction of the blacksmiths, and he had clearly heard enough. He walked toward them at a measured pace, not rushing, not posturing, just walking with the particular kind of unhurried certainty that suggested he had already decided how this was going to end and was simply moving toward that conclusion. He stopped beside Elena. Not in front of her. Beside her. He picked up the water buckets she had set down, held one in each hand, and looked at the assembled women with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unintimidated. "This conversation is finished," he said. Agnes's chin went up. "And who are you to say so? You're a nobody who wandered in off the frontier trail and convinced a desperate woman to sign a paper. You have no standing here, no land, no family, no—" "I have a wife," Rowan said, quietly. "And she is standing right here, and she does not need to justify herself to any of you." He turned to look at Elena. Something passed across his face, something she couldn't quite read, but which moved through her like the first warm wind at the end of a long winter. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." "Home," Marta Whitmore said, her voice raw with something that might have been grief. "You call that collapsing wreck home?" Elena stepped to Rowan's side. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. "We do." They walked away. Together. With 20 people watching and the cold wind off the frontier cutting across the road and the water bucket swinging from Rowan's hands, perfectly balanced. Behind them, Elena heard Agnes say something that provoked a ripple of laughter. She kept walking. Beside her, Rowan said nothing, but his arm brushed hers as they walked. Not reaching for her, just present, just close. And that small contact was, in its way, the most fortifying thing she had experienced in years. That evening, while the wind pushed against the walls of the repaired barn,
and the fire in the small hearth worked to maintain its modest territory against the cold, Elena sat at the kitchen table and watched her husband read. He read the way he did most things, quietly, entirely, without performance. She had questions. She had a great many questions, had always had them, about where he came from, about the quality of attention he brought to everything, about the way he sometimes stood very still and seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear, about the fact that despite his worn clothes and modest circumstances, he moved through the world with the kind of ease that suggested he had never in his entire life doubted his own right to take up space. She had been storing these questions for 3 weeks, setting them aside with the discipline of a woman who had learned that asking too much, wanting too much, was the fastest route to the particular kind of disappointment that couldn't be recovered from. But she was tired, and he was right there. And they were married, after all. Rowan. He looked up from the book. Where are you from? She watched his face carefully. Actually from a beat. Small, almost imperceptible. North, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. He closed the book, and for a moment he looked at her with that expression, that careful, weighing expression, and she had the sudden irrational conviction that he was deciding something important. Not yet, he said finally. I'll tell you. I promise. But not yet. Elena held his gaze. Are you in danger? Possibly. Is that why you came here? Partially. Rowan. She leaned forward slightly. I have committed myself to you, publicly, at considerable social cost. I think I'm owed more than partially. Something in his expression shifted, softened. You're right, he said. You are. And you will have all of it. I swear to you. He paused. But if I tell you now, everything changes, and I need... He stopped, seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. I need more time to be what I am here before I have to become what I am everywhere else. It was an answer that made no sense and simultaneously felt, somehow, like the most honest thing she had ever been told. She sat back, looked at him for another long moment. All right, she said. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if he had been holding something that he was now permitted to set down. Thank you, he said. And he said it in a way that suggested he meant something larger and more complicated than the words themselves. Elena picked up her mending. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was a steady voice against the walls. She did not yet know what her husband was. She did not yet know the weight of what she had married into, or the scope of the world that was about to open around her, or the magnitude of the forces that were already moving in the dark frontier beyond Black Hollow's boundaries, moving toward them, drawn like water toward a drain by whatever it was that Rowan Hale carried inside him. She did not know any of that, but she knew, with the absolute clarity of a woman who had spent 27 years learning to see things as they were, that she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, she had made the right choice. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the village's outermost fence line, something moved through the winter forest. Heavy, patient, not yet ready to announce itself, but watching, always watching. And in the worn loft above the blacksmith's shop, now empty, his few belongings already moved to the Whitmore property, there was nothing left but a thin layer of straw and the memory of a man who had arrived in Black Hollow pretending to be something small. The truth, as it always did, was waiting for its moment. The winter that settled over Black Hollow in the weeks following Elena's marriage was the kind that old-timers spoke about in the particular hushed tones reserved for things that had genuinely frightened them. Not the decorative cold of early November, with its picturesque frost on window panes and the pleasant crunch of the first thin ice underfoot, but the real thing. The deep structural cold that arrived in December, like an occupying force, drove the temperature down past any reasonable expectation, and simply stayed there, immovable, indifferent, as if it had decided that this particular valley between the northern ridgelines was where it intended to spend the season, and no amount of human suffering was going to persuade it otherwise. The creek froze, not the thin, temporary freezing of a cold snap, but solid to the bottom in the shallower sections, so that Elena had to take the axe out every morning and chip through to water. The livestock burned through feed at a rate that made her stomach clench every time she looked at the storage numbers. 2 of old Mercer's sheep died in the first hard week, not from the cold directly, but from the weakness that came from not having put on enough weight before the season turned. It was the kind of loss that rippled through a small community, because everyone in Black Hollow understood that old Mercer's sheep dying today was a preview of what could happen to any of them tomorrow if the cold held and the stores ran short. It held. Elena managed. She always managed. It was, at this point, the defining fact of her existence, the one thing no one in Black Hollow could take from her no matter how hard they tried. But managing was different now, in ways both practical and strange, because she was no longer managing alone. Rowan was a revelation in winter. This surprised her because she had expected, not uselessness exactly, but the particular limitations of a man who had arrived from somewhere unknown with a tired horse and worn boots. She had expected to be carrying the larger share of the survival work, as she always had, with him contributing what he could and her quietly compensating for the rest. She had expected to be the competent one. What she found instead was a partner who seemed to have an almost preternatural ability to anticipate what needed doing before it needed doing. He winterized the barn 2 days before the temperature dropped hard enough to make the work miserable. He reinforced the henhouse roof. Elena hadn't even known there was a problem with the henhouse roof. The day before, a wind came through that would have taken it off entirely. He rebanked the earth around the foundation of the house in a way that cut the draft through the kitchen floor by half, and he did it in an afternoon, working with the methodical efficiency of a person who had done this kind of work many times before. "Where did you learn to do that?" Elena asked, watching him work the earth with the back of a spade, packing it firm against the stone foundation. "Cold places," he said. She waited. He did not elaborate. She had learned, in the weeks since their marriage, that Rowan answered questions in the same way he did most things, honestly, but economically. He gave her what he chose to give her, and no more. Not from cruelty or deception, but from some deep habit of containment that she was slowly beginning to understand was not about her. It was about him, about whatever he was carrying. "You've lived through worse winters than this," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Much worse?" He paused in his work, looked out at the ridgeline to the north, where the gray sky sat heavy and low over the tree line. Something in his expression shifted into a distance that had nothing to do with the physical landscape in front of him. "Much worse," he said, and something in the way he said it made Elena decide not to push further. She went back to splitting firewood instead. But she watched him. She had always been a watcher. It was the primary survival skill she had developed over 27 years on the frontier's social margins. And what she saw, as the winter deepened and the days shortened to a thin gray strip between one dark and the next, was a man who was performing normalcy with a skill that suggested considerable practice. Not performing it falsely. That was what made it confusing. Everything Rowan did was genuine. His work was real. His care was real. The patience and attention he brought to the life they were building together were entirely, unmistakably real. But there was a layer underneath all of it, a stratum of something she couldn't quite reach, where the real architecture of who he was lived in the dark, maintained by a discipline so total it had become invisible. She thought about it most in the evenings, when the fire had burned down to coals and Rowan sat with his book or his maps. He had maps, carefully folded, which he looked at sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind that people only achieved when they had stopped needing to perform for each other. She trusted him. That was the thing that kept surprising her. She trusted him with a depth and a certainty that had no rational basis, given how little she actually knew about him, and that trust sat in her chest like a stone. Heavy, solid, immovable. She had never trusted anyone that way before. She found it, simultaneously, the most comforting and the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. The trouble started, as trouble in Black Hollow always started, at the market. It was a Thursday in mid-December, and Elena had gone because the last of the salt was nearly gone, and without salt the meat they'd stored for winter would not hold.
She had timed her visit for the early morning when the market was sparse enough that the particular gauntlet of public commentary her presence now reliably produced could be navigated with minimum exposure. She had her coat pulled up, her basket over her arm, and was conducting a masterclass in focused efficiency. Move, purchase, leave, when she made the mistake of stopping at Hanson's stall to examine a piece of cured leather she needed for the ox's harness. She heard Thomas Caldwell's voice before she saw him. Feel sorry for her, honestly. He was speaking to someone behind the neighboring stall, loudly enough to be sure Elena could hear. He was 24, broad-shouldered, and had the specific confidence of a young man who had never once had a room fall quiet when he entered it for the wrong reasons. She's made her bed, married a ghost, a man nobody knows the first thing about, and now she'll spend the winter finding out what nothing actually looks like from the inside. Does it bother you? Asked his companion. She turned you down. She turned down the idea of a decent life, Thomas said. That's not something to be bothered about. That's something to feel sorry about. Elena set down the piece of leather. She turned around. Thomas saw her immediately. His expression completed its journey from satisfaction to the specific discomfort of a person who had said a thing loudly and publicly and now had to own it. Thomas? Elena said pleasantly. Elena. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, which was more than she'd expected. I heard what you said. Then you'll know I was being charitable. I'll know you were being loud, she said, which isn't the same thing. She picked up her basket. Tell your mother I said hello. She walked away before he could respond, because she had learned that the most effective demolition of a certain kind of argument was to simply decline to participate in it. She heard the flush of silence behind her as she moved through the market, felt the eyes that tracked her progress. Some pitying, some amused, some that particular combination of the two that was the social currency of communities that ran on other people's difficulties. She bought the salt. She left. She was halfway home, on the road that ran along the creek, when she heard footsteps behind her moving too fast to be casual. She turned. It was Nora Vane, 23, the miller's youngest daughter, with red raw cheeks from the cold and an expression that suggested she had been working up to something for several days. Elena had always found Nora somewhat difficult to categorize because she had none of the deliberate cruelty of Agnes Caldwell or Dorothy Marsh, but she ran with that circle and absorbed its habits the way all young people absorb the dominant culture of their community, without necessarily choosing it. I need to talk to you, Nora said, slightly breathless from running. Elena waited. Nora glanced back toward the market, then back at Elena. They're saying things, she said, about your husband, not the usual things, different things. What things? Nora pulled her coat tighter, not from cold. My father saw him 2 nights ago, out past the eastern fence line, late, past midnight. He was out there in the dark, in the snow, moving along the tree line. She stopped. Alone, no lantern, just moving through the dark like he knew exactly where he was going. Elena kept her face still. Your father was also out past midnight. My father was checking a trap line. He had reason to be there. Nora's voice had dropped further. What was your husband doing out there, Elena? In the dark, past the fence line, alone, in the middle of a hard freeze? I don't know, Elena said. Honestly, because she didn't. But I imagine he had a reason. People are saying... Nora stopped, started again. Some people are saying he might be connected to the rogue activity. You know there have been attacks. 3 farms along the northern frontier before the freeze. They said a whole family, the Orvines over at Miller Creek. They just disappeared. No bodies, no signs, just gone. Her eyes were wide. And then your husband shows up out of nowhere around the same time and nobody knows where he came from. Nora. Elena's voice came out very flat and very calm, in the way that very flat, very calm voices sometimes carried more weight than shouted ones. Listen to what you are saying to me. Nora fell silent. You are telling me that the village gossip has moved from Elena married a nobody to Elena might have married a criminal, and you are bringing this to me because... Why? Because you're worried about me? Or because someone sent you to see how I'd react? Color flooded Nora's face. I'm worried. If you're worried about me, Elena said,
Then the next time someone in that market tries to connect my husband to criminal activity based on the fact that he was outside at night, you tell them that evidence requires more than proximity and rumor. She adjusted the basket on her arm. Thank you for the information. I mean that. Now go home before you freeze. She walked the rest of the way home without looking back. Gunshan. She did not ask Rowan about it that night. She went about the evening, fed the animals, made dinner, sat by the fire, and watched him with the patient attention she had always given the things she was trying to understand, and she turned the information over and over in her mind like a stone she was looking for a seam in. He had been out past midnight, past the fence line, in a hard freeze, moving along the tree line without a lantern. The Orvine family had disappeared along the northern frontier months ago, before the freeze, around the time he had arrived. She thought about his maps, the way he sometimes stood at the window in the evening and looked north, not at the sky, but at the ridgeline, with an expression that was not casual or wondering but focused, the way a person looked at something they were monitoring. She thought about the way he moved. She had been noticing it more in recent weeks, the quality of attention he gave to the space around him, the way he scanned the perimeter of a room when he entered it, the way he positioned himself with his back to walls and his face to doors, without seeming to think about it. She had assumed this was a frontier habit. Most people who had spent significant time in rough country developed some version of it. But it was more than that. It was the practiced situational awareness of someone who had spent years in genuine danger. "You're thinking very hard about something," Rowan said without looking up from the fire. "I'm always thinking hard about something. This is different." He looked at her then. "What is it?" She decided with the characteristic directness that had served her in every difficult conversation she had ever had to simply say the thing. "Someone saw you outside the fence line 2 nights ago, past midnight. No lantern." He looked at her. Nothing flickered in his expression. "Yes," he said. "What were you doing?" A beat. Longer than his usual ones. He looked at the fire, then back at her. "Scouting," he said. "For what?" "For what I told you I couldn't tell you yet." Elena set down the mending she'd been holding without actually working on. "Rowan, I need to understand what is happening. Not everything. I'm not asking for everything tonight, but enough. There have been disappearances along the frontier. People are frightened, and now they're connecting your presence to that fear, which means I know what it means." His voice had changed slightly. Still quiet, but with an edge she hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but something that suggested he had been aware of this trajectory and was not pleased about how quickly it was developing. "I know exactly what it means for you." "Then tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire worked steadily between them. Outside, the wind moved across the valley with the heavy patience of something that had all the time in the world. "There is a network," he said finally, "operating along the northern frontier. Human hunters, men who track and kill wolves for profit, and not the ordinary kind. They're working with rogue wolves who have gone feral and violent and beyond any pack law." He paused. "Together, they create chaos. The hunters drive wolf packs into conflict with human settlements. The rogues panic the packs, force them into territory violations. The result is massacres, mostly of the wolves, but of humans too, when humans are in the wrong place." His voice was even, but his jaw had tightened, and Elena noticed the tendons in his hands where they rested on his knees. The Orvine family did not disappear because rogues found them. They disappeared because they saw something they weren't supposed to see, and hunters made sure they couldn't report it. Elena felt the cold settle into her despite the fire. "How do you know this?" "Because it is my business to know it." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and something in them was very old and very tired. "Because people in my—" He stopped, chose a different word. "Because people I am responsible for have been dying because of this network for 2 years, and I came here because the intelligence I had indicated that Black Hollow is a staging point, a way station. There are hunters moving through this area, using it." "Who are you responsible for?" Elena asked. Her voice was very careful. He held her gaze. The fire popped. "Elena." "Who?" The silence went on for 3 full seconds. "A great many people.
he said. More than I can explain tonight. She stared at him. Her mind was moving very quickly, assembling and reassembling the pieces she had been collecting for weeks. The maps, the midnight scouting, the quality of his competence, the ease with which he moved through the world despite his apparent poverty, the strange, indefinable authority that seemed to sit in him like a permanent weight. You are not what you say you are. No, you are not a laborer. No. Then what? Not yet. His voice was rough with something that might have been urgency or might have been pain. Please, not yet. I need you to trust me a little longer. Elena looked at her husband for a long, still moment. The man who had fixed her fence posts and her roof and the henhouse she hadn't known was broken. The man who had looked at her across a barn aisle and said, I think you are extraordinary, with a directness that had moved something permanently out of place inside her. The man who was now telling her that the northern frontier was bleeding and that he had come to Black Hollow to stop it. Are you in danger? She asked. Right now, tonight. Are you safe? Something in his expression broke open, just slightly, just at the edges. I'm safe tonight. And me? Is my home... Are we a target? Not yet. I need to move faster before that changes. She picked up the mending again. Her hands were steady. Then move faster, she said. And when it is time to tell me the rest, you will tell me. I will. I swear it. I know, Elena said. I know you will. She said it not as reassurance. She said it as fact. The following week was the week Elena began to understand that the threat was closer than either of them had acknowledged out loud. It started with the dogs. 3 of them. Working dogs, frontier dogs, not the soft indoor animals of gentler places, but big mixed-breed animals that had been bred for alertness and had never in their lives shown fear of a shadow. Started behaving strangely along the village's northern perimeter. Not barking, which would have been reassuring in the way that barking always was, because barking was a known quantity. Instead, they stood rigid at the fence line in the early evenings and stared into the tree line with a fixed, paralyzed attention that was far more unsettling than any amount of noise. Then a boy, 11 years old, the blacksmith's son, came home from an errand to the northern pasture, white-faced and unable to explain clearly what he had seen, only that he had heard something in the trees that had made him run and that he had not looked back. Then one of the Miller farm's goats was found dead at the fence line with wounds that the village's most experienced farmers could not attribute to any local predator. The village held a meeting. Elena went because she had always gone to village meetings, partly from habit and partly because she had long ago decided that the people who complained most about how things were run were invariably the ones who had stopped showing up to the meetings where things were decided. She took a seat at the back of the community hall, which was the largest structure in Black Hollow. A drafty timber building that smelled permanently of sawdust and old smoke, and watched the village assemble around her with the particular attention she gave to social situations that had the potential to turn dangerous. Rowan was not with her. He had said that morning that he needed to do something that afternoon and might not be back before dark. She had asked him to be careful. He had looked at her with that expression, the one that was part gratitude and part something she still didn't have a name for, and said he would. She was sitting with that particular absence, trying not to let it distract her from the meeting, when Alderman Pike stood up and the room went quiet. Pike was 52, with the large, slow solidity of a man who had run on consensus and caution his entire life and had thus far been rewarded for it. He was not a bad man. He was the specific kind of man who became dangerous not through malice but through the combination of genuine concern and insufficient imagination. A man who, when afraid, defaulted to the tools that had always worked, which were find something to blame and act decisively against it. We have a situation, Pike said. Predator activity on the northern perimeter. I've spoken to the farmers and to the hunters in this community, and the consensus is that we're looking at either a wolf pack that has come too far south or, he paused, in the way of a man delivering something he knows won't land well, or rogue activity. The room murmured. We're going to organize watch parties, Pike continued. 3-man teams rotating through the night. We fortify the northern fence line. And he looked directly at Elena.
and she felt the weight of the room turn with him. And we deal with variables that we cannot account for. What variables? Someone asked, though from the quality of the silence that followed, Elena thought most people in the room already knew the answer. The stranger, said Agnes Caldwell from the front row. The man nobody knows, who arrived around the time the frontier trouble started, who has been seen outside the fence line at night. She turned to look at Elena with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for this moment. I think we all know what variable we're talking about. The room turned fully toward Elena. She sat very still and let them look. You want to accuse my husband of something, she said into the quiet. Her voice carried easily in the cold hall. Then say it plainly. Don't dress it up as variables. Agnes did not flinch. I'm saying he is a stranger we know nothing about, who moves around in the dark, and who arrived at the same time our frontier started bleeding. If that doesn't concern you, it concerns me enormously, Elena said. Which is why I would suggest that before this community does something it cannot undo, you consider that the man you want to accuse is also the man who has spent the last 3 months quietly reinforcing every piece of failing infrastructure on the northern end of this village, who patched old Mercer's barn roof in October without being asked, who recut the drainage ditch behind the school so it doesn't flood the floor every time it rains. She looked around the room. If he meant this village harm, he has had ample opportunity. Harm can take many forms, Dorothy Marsh said. From the middle of the room with the particular confidence of a woman who felt the room was with her. Then be specific, Elena said. What form exactly are you accusing him of? No one was specific. No one could be, because they didn't have anything except fear and proximity, and the village's long-standing practice of directing its anxiety toward whoever was most available. Elena could feel the shape of it, the way the room wanted an outlet, wanted something it could act against, and had settled on her husband because he was the easiest available target. She could also feel, with the calm certainty of a woman who had been in this position before, that there was nothing she was going to say in this room tonight that would change that. The meeting ended without a formal resolution, which was not the same as ending without consequence. Decisions made in rooms full of frightened people did not require formal resolutions. They just required enough people to leave the meeting feeling that something needed to be done. Elena walked home through the dark and the cold with her jaw set and her mind moving in fast, cold circles. He was back before she reached the house. She saw the light in the kitchen window from 50 yards away and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding since she'd left for the meeting. She pushed open the door without knocking. It was her door, her house, and found him at the kitchen table with one of his maps spread out, a lantern burning close, and an expression on his face that changed immediately when he saw hers. What happened? He said. Not a question. The village had a meeting. She hung up her coat. They're organizing watch parties. They're also considering what to do about variables they cannot account for, she said, and let the weight in her voice convey the quotation marks. You are the variable in question. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then he looked up at her. How much time do I have? Before they do something formal? I don't know. Before they do something informal. She paused. Less. He nodded slowly. His hand moved to the map, traced a line along the northern ridge. I found something today, he said. She came to the table, looked at the map. He had made marks on it, in a hand that was precise and practiced, annotations that used a shorthand she didn't recognize. What kind of something? A camp. Old, used and abandoned, maybe 2 weeks ago, but large. 6 to 8 men, by the fire rings, and wolf sign. His finger stopped on the map, at a point perhaps 4 miles north of the village. They're not gone. They moved further east, but they're still operating in this area. He looked at her. They'll circle back. The staging pattern I've been tracking. They work an area in a spiral. They'll be back within the month. Elena looked at the map, at the marks he had made, at the shorthand annotations she didn't recognize. That looked like something between a military notation and a language she had never encountered. Rowan, she said carefully, the watch parties they're organizing, they're going to be armed men walking along the northern fence line at night. If those hunters are watching this village, and if they see organized armed patrols, they'll accelerate, he said. Yes, I know. which means whatever you're planning to do, you have to do it before Pike's watch parties start and accidentally provoke an attack. She kept her voice very level, which means you're running out of time. He looked at her for a long moment. In the lantern light, his face was all shadow and angle, and his eyes had that quality, that seen clearly quality, that had unsettled her and then drawn her, and was now so familiar it felt like something that had always been there, like the creek or the ridge. I have to contact some people, he said. People who can help me end this quickly. I've been avoiding it because... He stopped. Because contacting them reveals where you are, she said. He looked at her. And reveals what you are, she said. Which changes everything, as you said. Yes. He said it very quietly. Elena put her hand on the map, on the marks he had made, on the evidence of the work he had been doing alone in the dark for 3 months, carrying this burden with the specific silence of a man who had spent so long being responsible for things too large to share that solitude had become indistinguishable from habit. Then contact them, she said. Elena, contact them. Do what you have to do. She met his gaze. And when it's done, you tell me everything. All of it. No more not yet. His jaw worked. Something moved through his face that she had not seen before. Something raw and uncontained, as if one of the walls he maintained had developed a crack that was widening too fast to repair. When it's done, he said, I promise you. When it's done. She nodded. She took her hand off the map and went to put water on for tea, because some situations required practical actions to keep the mind from outrunning itself. Behind her, she heard the very faint sound of Rowan exhaling, long, controlled, like a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. Outside, the wind moved across the valley. The dogs at the northern perimeter were quiet tonight, which was either a good sign or the worst sign of all, depending on what they had decided there was no longer any point in barking at. She woke before dawn the next morning to find his side of the bed empty, the house cold, and a single note on the kitchen table written in his careful, precise hand. Back by nightfall. Don't go past the fence line today. Trust me. Elena folded the note, looked at the dark window, looked at the maps he had left spread on the table, and the marks on them that she still couldn't read. Then she built up the fire, because the animals needed feeding and the day would not wait, and she went to work. She was at the barn when she heard it, distant, carried on the cold air from somewhere north of the ridge, a sound that was not quite animal and not quite human, that lasted for no more than 2 seconds before the wind took it away. A sound like a command, like an authority so absolute it moved through solid matter. Elena stood very still in the barn doorway with her hand on the post, and something in the deepest, most instinctive part of her, the part that had been making accurate assessments of danger her entire life, went completely, electrically quiet. Something was coming. She did not know yet whether it was coming for Black Hollow or coming to Black Hollow, but it was coming, and the man she had married was somewhere out in the frozen dark between this village and whatever was moving toward it, carrying secrets she still didn't know the full weight of, alone. She gripped the barn post harder. She trusted him. She had chosen him. But trust, she had learned, did not make the waiting easier. It only made it bearable. The sound did not come again. Elena stood in the barn doorway for a full minute after it faded, hand on the post, listening to the silence that followed with the focused attention of someone who understood that what came after a sound was often more informative than the sound itself. The goats shifted in their stall. Margot stamped once, then went still. The old ox breathed slow and even. The winter morning held its breath around her, gray and cold and absolute, and gave her nothing. She went back to work. This was the discipline she had built her life on. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear be the loudest thing in the room. She fed the animals. She broke the ice on the water trough with 3 hard swings of the axe. She carried the morning's milk to the cold shelf in the root cellar and checked the stores with the methodical attention she gave them every 3rd day, counting and calculating with the automatic precision of a woman who had learned that the difference between surviving winter and not surviving it was often a matter of knowing your numbers before the crisis, not during. The numbers were not good. They were not catastrophic. She had done this long enough to have built margins into her planning, but they were tight in the way that frontier winters always made things tight, and the additional mouth to feed, however welcome, had compressed those margins further. She would need to trade for more grain before the end of January, which meant she would need to go to the market, which meant another walk through Black Hollow's particular gauntlet of barely concealed hostility, except that now the hostility had a sharper edge to it, because now it was not just social. Now it was edged with the specific fear of a community that had decided it had found something to blame for its anxiety, and that something lived in her house. She was in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had made more for the warmth of the cup than any genuine interest in drinking it, when she heard the horses, more than one, moving fast, coming from the direction of the main road. She went to the window. 4 riders coming to a hard stop in front of the house. She recognized 2 of them. Alderman Pike, on his gray gelding, and beside him, red-faced from the cold and from something that looked like urgency, Thomas Caldwell. The other 2 were men she knew less well. Harrow, who ran the northern trapline, and a large, silent man named Croft, who had worked for various farms in the area for years without ever quite belonging to any of them. Elena set down her tea and opened the door before they could knock. Pike looked at her from the horseback with the expression of a man who was doing something he had convinced himself was necessary and had not yet finished convincing himself it was right. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "Alderman." She kept one hand on the doorframe. "You're here early. We need to speak with your husband." "He's not here." Pike's jaw tightened. "Where is he?" "I don't know his exact location." Technically true. She held Pike's gaze without difficulty. "Is there something I can help you with?" "We found tracks," Thomas said. He was less controlled than Pike, younger, and his voice had the rough edge of a man running on insufficient sleep and too much fear. "North of the fence line. This morning, before light." Croft went out to check on the watch points and found tracks in the snow. Wolf tracks. Large ones. Moving south toward the village. And beside them, he stopped. Beside them, boot prints. Same direction. Moving together. Elena's hands were very still on the doorframe. "Wolf tracks and boot prints, moving together, headed toward this village," Pike said. "And your husband is not here, and you don't know where he is." He paused. "You understand how this looks." "I understand how you're choosing to interpret it," Elena said. "That is not the same thing as how it looks." Elena. It was Harrow who said it, and he said it in a different register than the others. Not hostile, but genuinely frightened, in the way that experienced frontier men became frightened, which was worse than ordinary fear because it was earned. "I've been running traps in this territory for 15 years. Those weren't pack wolves. The stride, the weight, the pattern, those were rogue prints, and something was guiding them south, deliberately." She felt the cold working through the open door. She felt the weight of 4 men's attention on her, and behind it the weight of the entire village, which was represented in these 4 riders whether they had been formally appointed to it or not. She felt, somewhere beneath all of that, the memory of a sound. 2 seconds, carried on wind from the north, like a command, like an authority moving through solid matter. "Don't go past the fence line today. Trust me." "What are you intending to do?" she asked. "We're going to find your husband," Pike said, "and ask him to account for himself, publicly, today." His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man trying to stay on the right side of a line he could feel himself approaching. If his answers are satisfactory, that's the end of it. If they're not, and if he's not back by the time your patience runs out, Elena asked, what then? The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know about what then looked like. She looked at the 4 men on horseback in front of her house and made a calculation. The same kind of rapid, cold-eyed calculation she had been making her entire life, in situations with less to lose but the same essential structure. What is the actual danger here? What actions are available? And what does each action cost? The actual danger. A village that was frightened and looking for a target, in possession of just enough circumstantial information to justify the kind of collective action that, once started, was very difficult to stop. A husband somewhere north of the fence line, doing something she didn't have the full details of, who would come home tonight,
if he came home tonight, to find the situation had deteriorated past the point of simple conversation.
The available actions? Wait, which ceded all control. Follow, which violated the only direct instruction he had given her. Or, I'll come with you, she said. Pike blinked. I beg your pardon? When Rowan comes back, she stepped back from the door. I'll come with you to whatever meeting you're planning. I won't fight it. I won't make it harder than it needs to be. She held Pike's gaze. But you will give him the chance to speak. You will not act before he has spoken. And you will conduct this, she chose the word carefully, conversation in the town square, not behind closed doors or out past the fence line where there are no witnesses. Pike looked at her. Why the square? Because I grew up in this village, Elena said, and I know what happens to things that happen without witnesses. Another silence. Pike looked at Harrow, who looked at the ground, then back at Elena. The square, he said, when he returns. When he returns, she agreed. She closed the door. She spent the next 4 hours doing the most mundane things she could find to do, because mundane tasks were the only reliable anchor she had found against the specific kind of anxiety that came from knowing something was coming and not knowing its shape. She reorganized the root cellar. She mended the hem of her second coat. She resoled a boot that had been developing a slow leak in the left heel for 3 weeks. She spoke to Margot in the quiet, conversational way she had noticed Rowan did. Not baby talk, not performance, just the simple acknowledgement of another creature's presence. And the horse listened with her ears forward and her large dark eyes steady. And Elena found this, irrationally, fortifying. He came back at 2 p.m. She heard the door and was in the kitchen before it had fully opened, and she was looking at him before he had taken off his coat, and what she saw in his face told her immediately that whatever he had been doing this morning, it had not gone the way he'd planned. He was whole. No injuries she could see, but there was a quality of tension in him she had not seen before, a compressed urgency that he was visibly working to contain. His coat had mud on the left side, as if he had gone down hard on that knee at some point. His right hand had a cut across the knuckles that had been tended to, field-dressed, with a strip of cloth from his own shirt. You're hurt, she said. It's nothing. He looked at her. You look like you have something to tell me. Pike and 3 others were here this morning. They found tracks, wolf tracks and boot prints together, moving toward the village from the north. Something passed through his face, quick, controlled. What did you tell them? I told them you weren't here and I didn't know where you were. She paused. I also told them that when you came back, I would come with them to a public conversation in the town square. She watched him carefully. I needed to keep it public. I needed witnesses. He looked at her for a moment. You're managing the situation. Someone has to. He almost smiled. It was a strange, complicated expression. Not quite amusement, not quite pain, somewhere between the two in a way that she had no category for. Then he sat down at the table, slowly, and pressed the knuckles of his uninjured hand against his mouth for a moment, thinking. Rowan. She sat across from him. What happened out there today? I made contact, he said. The people I told you about, he paused. They're coming. 2 days, maybe 3. I couldn't give them a more specific location without exposing. He stopped again. The habit of containment was fighting the evident urgency of the situation, and she could see it working in his face, that internal negotiation between what he had always kept back and what the moment now demanded. The rogues are moving, he said. That's what the tracks were. I was trying to redirect them, push them further east, buy time. It didn't fully work. He looked at his injured hand. One of them found me. Elena's breath caught. You fought a rogue wolf. I'm fine. That's not... She stopped herself. Are there more coming before your people arrive? I don't know. Possibly. He looked at her directly. The attack I've been trying to prevent. It may happen before I have the support in place to stop it cleanly. How bad? Bad. He said it flatly, without dramatic inflation, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. Not the village's idea of bad. Not a farm animal and some frightened dogs. Bad. The kind of attack that leaves nothing standing.
The kitchen was very quiet. "Then we don't have 2 days," Elena said. "No." "What do you need?" He looked at her, really looked at her, in that way he had, the way that had unsettled her when she first encountered it, and that now felt like the most reliable thing she knew. "To do what needs to be done, I need to stop pretending to be what I'm not." He reached up to his neck, where the collar of his shirt sat close and simple, and she noticed for the first time, had he been wearing it since he arrived? She thought he had. She had simply never focused on it. A thin band at his throat. Not a collar in the traditional sense, something finer, something that sat against his skin with the deliberate placement of a thing that was meant to be there. "There will be no going back," he said. "Once I do this, everything changes." "Everything already has to change," Elena said. "You just told me this village might not be standing in 2 days." He looked at his hands. "Rowan." She leaned forward. "Whatever you are, whatever is on the other side of this, I chose you. That was not a conditional choice." She paused. "But you need to stop protecting me from information I need to have." The fire worked between them. The afternoon light was already going thin and gray, the early dark of deep winter beginning to press against the windows. "My name," he said slowly, "is not Rowan Hale." She had known this was coming. She had been ready for it, and yet the simple declarative weight of it still landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "No," she said. "My name is Alaric Valerian." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and they were very old now and very direct and entirely, nakedly honest, with none of the careful management she had grown used to. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Elena stared at him. The clock on the wall measured 6 full seconds. "The Alpha King," she said. "Yes." "Of the Northern Territories?" "Yes." He did not look away. "All of them. The mountain packs, the valley packs, the frontier settlements. Everything from the northern ridge to the Valin coast falls under my authority." A pause. "I came here in disguise because intelligence gathered by my scouts indicated that Black Hollow was a key staging point for the conspiracy I've been dismantling. I could not arrive with a royal guard. It would have driven the hunters underground, and we'd have lost the network entirely." He paused. "I needed to be invisible, anonymous. A nobody." "A drifter with a tired horse," Elena said. "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him and her hands at her sides and looked at the gray winter light on the frozen yard and thought, with the clarity that came to her in moments of genuine shock, about all the small pieces she had been collecting for months. The maps, the midnight scouting, the quality of his authority, the way he moved through the world, the shorthand notation she didn't recognize, the way the single hardest men in the frontier settlements she had encountered stepped back slightly when they came within his radius without seeming to know why they did it. She thought, I knew. Not the specifics, not this, but she had known that the real architecture of him was built on a scale that his performance of simplicity didn't fit. She had known it the way you knew a thing before you had the language for it, in the body, in the instinct, in the part of the mind that processed pattern before the rest of the mind had caught up. "The woman who gave you the horse," she said. "Margot." "My mother," Alaric said. "She died 8 years ago. She always said that horses and names were the most honest gifts." A pause. "She would have liked you." Elena turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, because he had never allowed it. It was the look of a man who had been holding something in his hands for a very long time, something precious and breakable, and had finally set it down and was now simply standing there, open-handed, without the shield of the secret to protect him. He was afraid. Not of the wolves or the hunters or the rogues moving in the dark north of this village. He was afraid of her, of what she would do with this. "You married me," she said. "Yes. As the Alpha King. You—" She stopped. "This wasn't— You weren't—" She was not a woman who lost her words, but she was losing them now, not from distress, but from the sheer scale of what was being rearranged inside her. "You chose to marry me."
knowing what you are. I didn't plan it, he said. I want you to understand that. I came here to investigate. I planned to spend 2 months, gather evidence, return north and end the conspiracy with force. He was very still. And then I met you. His voice had changed again, quieter now, stripped of everything except the simple truth of it. And everything I had planned became significantly more complicated. Elena looked at her husband, at the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, sitting at her battered kitchen table in the house he had spent 3 months quietly repairing, with mud on his coat and a field-dressed cut on his knuckles from fighting a rogue wolf alone in the dark to protect a village that was currently organizing a public humiliation for him. "You absolute idiot," she said, with tremendous feeling. Something broke open in his face. That almost smile again, but wider now, more complicated and more real. "I have been told," he said, "that this is a minority opinion. By people who are afraid of you. Generally, yes. I'm not afraid of you. I know." And he said it with the same weight he had brought to everything else, that specificity, that directness, as if he were talking about a physical fact of the world rather than an emotional one. "That's rather the point." Elena took a breath, long, slow, the kind that resets the machinery. Then she came back to the table and sat down. "How many people in this village know what you are?" "None." "How many of the rogues know you're here?" "Their handlers do. The wolves themselves, possibly. I've been suppressing—" He reached up and touched the thin band at his throat. "This contains my aura, my alpha presence. Without it, every wolf within a significant radius would feel what I am. I've been wearing it since I arrived to avoid detection. And if you take it off, every wolf in range, pack or rogue, will know immediately what they're in the presence of." His voice was careful. "Pack wolves will submit. Rogues will either run or—" "Fight," Elena said. "Yes." She looked at the thin band at his throat. Such a small thing, such an ordinary-looking thing to be containing something that large. "Pike is going to come here this afternoon," she said, "with the village. They're going to try to run you out, or worse, before whatever is coming arrives. And if you're not here, or if you're not able to—" She stopped. "The timing is the problem. If the rogues attack tonight, and your guards are 2 days out, and the village is in the middle of trying to publicly arrest you, then we're handling multiple crises simultaneously with no margin for error," Alaric said. "Yes, I know. So we need Pike's meeting to happen before nightfall." He looked at her steadily. "We go to the square," Elena said. "We get it done. Whatever it is, whatever you have to show them, we do it now, in daylight, before the dark comes and everything gets worse." She paused. "Unless you have a better plan." "I don't have a better plan," he said. "Then let's go." She had lived in Black Hollow her entire life, and she had never seen the town square this full. It seemed as though every resident, all 230 of them, down to the oldest grandmothers who rarely left their fires and the youngest children who rarely stayed still, had found their way to the square by 4 o'clock, drawn by whatever invisible current ran through small communities when something large was approaching its boiling point. They stood in the cold in their coats and their scarves, breath misting, and the square had the quality of a held breath. That particular silence that preceded something everyone present understood was going to be significant, and no one was certain would end well. Elena walked in with Alaric beside her. She had asked him, as they walked from the house, whether he was ready. He had said, "Are you?" She had thought about it honestly and said, "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He had looked at her with that expression, the open-handed one, the one without the shield, and said, very quietly, "That is why." She had understood him completely and had not answered, because some things didn't require an answer. Pike stood at the center of the square with Harrow and Thomas Caldwell and Croft, and approximately half the village's male population arranged behind him in the loose, dangerous configuration of men who had decided something and were waiting to see if it could be done without violence. Agnes Caldwell was in the front of the crowd. Dorothy Marsh was beside her. Nora Vane was further back, her face tight with something that might have been guilt. And Elena's mother, Marta Whitmore, was standing at the edge of the assembled crowd with her arms crossed and her face set in that geological expression, and she looked at her daughter walking across the square and said nothing, which was somehow worse than all the things she could have said. Elena stopped 6 feet from Pike. Alaric stopped beside her. "You came," Pike said. He sounded almost surprised. "I said I would," Elena said. Pike looked at Alaric, at this man who had been in his village for 4 months, working quietly at the margins, marrying a woman no one valued, fixing things no one had asked him to fix. He looked at him with the uncertain authority of a man doing something that felt necessary and troubled him at the same time. "We need answers," Pike said, "about who you are, where you come from, why you've been operating outside the fence line at night." He paused. "And about those tracks." Alaric looked at Pike. He looked at the assembled village. Then he looked at Elena, beside him, and she met his gaze and gave him the small, steady nod that meant, "I'm here. Do what you came here to do." He reached up. His fingers found the thin band at his throat. Agnes Caldwell said loudly, "What is he?" He removed it. The effect was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things were usually depicted. There was no light, no sound, no visible transformation. But something happened in that square. Something that moved through the air like the pressure change before a storm. A wave of presence so total and so absolute that every person in that crowd felt it in their chest like a second heartbeat, sudden and enormous, and entirely unlike anything they had experienced. The wolves felt it first. Thomas Caldwell went to his knees. He did not appear to decide to do this. His legs simply gave way beneath him, as if the muscles had received an instruction from somewhere deeper than his own volition. Croft went down beside him. Harrow, 15 years on the frontier, a man who had faced down pack wolves at close range and not flinched, sat down hard in the snow as if the air had gone out of him. The 6 other wolf-blooded men and women in the crowd, people whose heritage was not publicly known in the village, people who had lived their entire lives without knowing why they sometimes felt things that others didn't, why they sometimes heard things at the edges of hearing, why the dark felt less threatening to them than it should. They all felt it simultaneously, and each of them, without exception, went still in the particular way of creatures in the presence of something infinitely larger than themselves. Even the dogs, tied to posts at the market stalls, went flat to the ground and did not make a sound. Alderman Pike, full human, middle-aged, practical and deliberate, and not given to mysticism in any form, looked at Alaric Valerian and felt something that he would spend the rest of his life struggling to put words to, the absolute bone-deep certainty that he was standing in the presence of something that outranked every category he had available. Alaric let the waves settle. He did not expand it further. He had not removed the collar to dominate these people. He had removed it to show them the truth, and those were different things, and he understood the difference precisely. "My name is Alaric Valerian," he said. His voice carried across the square without effort, not because he was shouting, but because it was that kind of voice, the kind that filled space by nature. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The silence in the square was total. "I came to Black Hollow 4 months ago under a false name to investigate a conspiracy operating along your frontier. A network of rogue wolves and human hunters has been working in this territory for 2 years. They have killed families, destroyed pack settlements, and used this village as a staging ground without your knowledge." He paused. "I'm telling you this now because that conspiracy is about to act against this village directly, and I am out of time to be subtle about it." Agnes Caldwell was standing with her hand over her mouth. Dorothy Marsh had gone the color of old chalk. Marta Whitmore had not moved, but something in her face had changed. The geological certainty of her contempt had developed a crack, and through the crack showed something raw and disoriented and genuine. Thomas Caldwell, still on his knees in the snow, looked up at the man he had publicly mocked and dismissed, and called a ghost and a vagrant, and had absolutely nothing to say. Pike found his voice first. "How do we know?" "You feel it," Alaric said simply. "Every wolf-blooded person in this square is currently on the ground. That is not theater, Alderman. That is what I am." Pike looked around him, looked at the men on their knees, at the dogs flat on the ground, at the quality of absolute stillness that had taken the square. He was a practical man. He dealt in evidence. This was evidence. "The attack?" he said slowly. "When?" "Tonight. Possibly before midnight." Alaric's voice was even, but there was steel underneath it now. the steel of a man who had contained himself for 4 months and was done with containing. Which means we have approximately 3 to 4 hours to prepare this village for a coordinated assault by rogue wolves and armed hunters. He looked at Pike steadily. I can stop it, but I need this village working with me, not against me. The square was quiet for another long moment. Then Pike straightened his back, squared his jaw, and said, What do you need? And Elena, standing beside her husband in the middle of the village that had spent 27 years grinding her down, watched the Alpha King begin to organize the defense of Black Hollow with the quiet, absolute efficiency of a man returning to his natural state, and felt something she could not immediately name, something large and warm and slightly terrifying, move through her chest and settle there. She was still standing when Agnes Caldwell caught her eye. Agnes, who had been the loudest, the cruelest, the most deliberate in her public performances of Elena's worthlessness. Agnes, whose face was now a complicated landscape of shock and chagrin and something that looked from a certain angle like shame. Elena held her gaze. She did not smile. She did not smirk. She simply stood, straight-backed, beside the man she had married when he had nothing, or appeared to have nothing. And she let Agnes Caldwell look at what she had built and what she had chosen and what she was. Then she turned to her husband. Tell me what I can do, she said. He looked at her, and in his eyes was everything he had not yet fully said, everything that was coming, the size of the world that was about to open around them, the magnitude of the life that waited beyond this frozen square in this frontier village at the edge of the known territory. Stay close, he said. Whatever happens tonight, stay close. Behind them, at the northern fence line, one of the watchdogs began to bark. Then all of them did. And the dark this time did not stay quiet. The dogs did not stop barking. That was the first thing. The sound of them. All 6 of the village's working dogs at the northern perimeter. Not the sharp intermittent barking of animals reacting to a smell or a shadow, but the sustained, full-throated alarm of creatures that had seen something and needed the world to understand that the something was real and it was close and it was coming. That sound carried across the square and hit the assembled crowd the way cold water hits a sleeping face, instant, total, clarifying. Alaric was already moving before the last echo of his words had settled. Pike, he said, and his voice had changed completely, not louder, but denser, packed with the kind of authority that moved through people rather than stopping at the surface. Get everyone inside, not the outer houses, the community hall, the mill, the blacksmiths, structures with stone foundations. Move them now. Pike, to his considerable credit, did not ask questions. He turned to the crowd and started issuing orders with the direct efficiency of a man who had just recalibrated his entire understanding of the situation and was adapting in real time. You heard him. Families with children first. Move. The square began to empty with the controlled urgency of people who were frightened but had a direction to move in, which was infinitely better than frightened people with nowhere to go. Elena watched them flow toward the community hall and the mill and felt the transition happening around her, the village reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. She felt a hand on her arm. Elena, Alaric's voice, close. She turned. His face was different now. Not the careful, contained performance of Rowan Hale, not even the direct honesty of the man at her kitchen table. This was something older and more fundamental. The face of a person in their native element, where every instinct and every trained response was perfectly aligned with the moment. I need you to coordinate the civilians. Pike has authority here, but the women will listen to you. Get the children to the mill. It has the thickest walls. Anyone who can shoot, get them to the second-floor windows of the hall. Who can't go to the hall? The elderly, the very young, the ones who can't move fast. Get them to the root cellars. Underground is better if the fighting reaches the buildings. He paused. 1 second, just one, in which something personal moved through the operational precision of his expression. You know this village better than I do. Use that. I know, she said. Go. He held her gaze for that single second longer. Then he turned and moved toward the northern fence line with a speed and directness that parted the remaining crowd around him like water parting around stone. Elena turned to the square. Marta Whitmore was still standing where she had been standing when everything changed. She was looking in the direction Alaric had gone, and her face was doing something complicated that Elena didn't have time to analyze. Around her, people were moving, flowing, the organized chaos of a community mobilizing under threat. "Mama," Elena said. Her mother turned. "I need your help." Elena did not have time for the complicated history of them, for the weight of everything that had been said and done and left unsaid over 27 years. She set it aside with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. "You know who in this village can't move on their own. I need a list, and I need it now." Something shifted in Marta's face. The complicated expression collapsed into something simpler and more functional, and Elena recognized with a distant, brief clarity that her mother had once been a woman who could do this, who had done this, probably, in harder times before grief and resentment had calcified her. "Old Werner," Marta said immediately. "He can't manage the stairs to the hall. And the Finch baby, Petra's mother had her 2 weeks early. She shouldn't be moved in the cold if we can help it. Root cellar at the south end. It's the deepest one." Elena was already moving. "Take Werner yourself. I'll send someone to the Finches." Her mother nodded once, a short, functional nod, utterly unlike any interaction they had had in years, and moved. Elena moved faster. Mutt. The next 40 minutes were the most purely functional of Elena Whitmore's life. She had always been good in crises. This was not something she had ever been praised for, because in Black Hollow, crises were supposed to be managed by men with authority, and the fact that Elena managed them better than most of those men was noted and immediately resented rather than valued. But she had never had a crisis quite like this one. Never had the full scope of her competence called upon all at once. Never had a clear mandate and a community actually listening to her. And what she discovered in those 40 minutes was that she was extraordinary at it. She moved through the village in a pattern she could have walked blindfolded, and she applied 3 months of Alaric's lessons about threat assessment and structural defensibility to knowledge she had built over a lifetime. The mill's stone walls, the blacksmith's forge, which could be used, the root cellars, their depths and their access points, the gaps in the northern fence line. She knew every one of them, had been noting them for years and reporting them to Pike's maintenance committee to precisely zero effect. And she sent Thomas Caldwell, who was on his feet again and white-faced with the urgency of a man trying to compensate for months of petty mockery, to reinforce the 3 largest gaps with timber from the supply stack behind the hall. He went without a word of argument. Dorothy Marsh, who had been one of the most consistent voices in the village's long project of Elena's humiliation, found herself taking direction from Elena on where to position the women with rifles at the hall's upper windows, and she did it. Did it well, actually, with the competence of a woman who had survived on the frontier for 40 years and knew how to listen when listening mattered. She didn't apologize. There wasn't time for apologies. But she listened and she moved, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Agnes Caldwell, to Elena's genuine surprise, appeared at her elbow as she was organizing the third group toward the root cellars and said without preamble, "What do you need?" Elena looked at her. "Can you handle a rifle?" "Better than Thomas ever could." "Second floor, east window. You'll have the clearest sight line to the fence line from there." Agnes went. The square was nearly empty when Elena finished her circuit and came back to the northern end of the village, where the fence line ran along the creek's frozen path. The dogs had gone silent, which was worse than the barking. The silence had the quality of a collective held breath, the silence of animals that had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion they didn't know how to vocalize. She found Harrow at the fence line, crouched over the snow, reading the ground the way experienced trackers read it. Not as individual marks, but as a narrative. He looked up when she stopped beside him. "How many?" she asked. "More than I thought," he said. He had gone very quiet in the way that men went quiet when they had revised their estimate of danger upward and were still processing the revision. "The wolf sign. There are at least 8, maybe 10, and the hunter tracks," he pointed. 4 sets, coming from the east and the northwest simultaneously. He looked at her. "This isn't a raid. This is a coordinated assault. Someone planned this." "I know," Elena said, "which means they planned for a village that didn't know they were coming. They didn't plan for what we have now." Harrow looked at her steadily. What do we have now? Elena heard it before she could answer him. From the direction of the northern tree line, approximately 400 yards out, came a sound she had heard before. Just once, that morning in the barn doorway, 2 seconds carried on wind, a command moving through solid matter. But this time it wasn't 2 seconds. This time it went on and on and on, and it was enormous, and it moved across the frozen ground and through the fence posts and through the soles of her boots and into her spine like the first deep note of something vast and old. Harrow went to one knee. Elena stood. Through the tree line, something was moving, not the cautious, strategic movement of the rogue she had been bracing for. Something else. Something that moved through the dark winter trees with the absolute confidence of a creature that had never, in its entire existence, had reason to be cautious about anything in these territories. The first wolf that came out of the tree line was the size of a draft horse. She had known, intellectually, from everything Alaric had told her and everything she had pieced together herself, that this was possible. That the Alpha King's wolf form was not the same as other wolves. That the scale of it, the power of it, was categorically different from anything that could be found in the ordinary world. Knowing it and seeing it were different things entirely. He was silver gray, so dark in places he was almost black, and he moved through the snow with a silence that made no physical sense given his size. His eyes were the same gray-green as the man's eyes, and they swept the perimeter of the village with the same sweeping situational assessment she had watched Alaric conduct in every room he had ever entered. Behind him, from the east, something moved in the trees. The rogues came out of the forest in a pack, 8 of them, as Harrow had estimated, with the frantic, destabilized movement of wolves that had been operating without pack law for long enough that coordination had degraded into mob instinct. They were large, but they were not what Alaric was. The difference was so immediately apparent that Elena found herself thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes came under extreme stress, of a creek and a river. The same element, the same basic nature, but on entirely different scales. Behind the rogues, at the tree line's edge, humans. 4 of them, as Harrow had tracked, armed with the specific equipment of professional hunters, crossbows, steel-tipped and reinforced, and something that Elena identified after a half-second of confused recognition as a net launcher, the kind used to capture rather than kill, which told her that at least some part of the plan tonight had been about taking rather than destroying. Taking, she thought. Taking what? Taking who? She thought about the collar Alaric had worn for 4 months, the collar that had hidden what he was. She thought about the network he had described, hunters and rogues working together, driving wolf packs into conflict, creating chaos along the frontier. She thought about a conspiracy that had been operating for 2 years and hadn't been stopped. She thought, they know he's here. They didn't come to raid a village. They came because someone told them the Alpha King was in Black Hollow, and they came to capture him. Harrow, she said, I see them. The hunters have a net launcher. Their target isn't the village. She turned to him. Stay here. Watch the fence line on the west side. They may have a second team. If you see movement, fire once in the air. Do you understand? Where are you going? She was already moving. What happened next was something that the people of Black Hollow would spend years attempting to describe to people who hadn't been there and would always fail, because the language available to them was built for human-scale events, and what they witnessed in the frozen field north of the village fence line on that December night was not a human-scale event. Elena got to the top of the fence line embankment, a raised earth ridge that gave her a sightline over the perimeter, just as the rogues hit the first open ground between the tree line and the fence. Alaric met them there. She had thought, watching him move through the trees, that she understood what she was seeing. She had revised that estimate immediately and comprehensively upon watching the Alpha King engage 8 rogue wolves simultaneously in open ground. It was not the battle she had braced for, not the brutal, grinding attrition of evenly matched opponents. It was something more like a force of nature moving through obstacles, precise and overwhelming and utterly controlled, in the way that the most dangerous things were always controlled. Not wildly, not chaotically, but with the specific discipline of power that had been lived with for long enough to be entirely mastered. He took the first 2 before they had fully registered his presence. Not killing blows,
She understood, watching, that he was choosing his force carefully, incapacitating rather than destroying when he could, because these were wolves gone rogue through manipulation and madness rather than through nature, and something in him refused to treat them as simply as the hunters who drove them. He drove the third into the snow with his full weight and held it there until it went still, then released it. The remaining 5 pulled back, not running, circling, recalculating, doing the thing that cornered and damaged things did when they encountered something that had exceeded their model of the possible. The hunters at the tree line were not retreating. Elena watched them raise the net launcher. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move. The embankment was 8 feet high at this point, with a rough wooden ladder that she climbed in 3 steps. The ground on the other side was frozen hard, and she landed badly, rolling her left ankle in a way that sent a white spike of pain up her leg. And she registered it and dismissed it and kept moving because there was no version of what came next in which she stopped moving. She had a rifle. She had carried it out of habit when she left the hall, because she had grown up on the frontier and she did not walk into uncertain situations without a rifle. And the habit that her mother had called reckless and that had saved her from a cornered wild boar when she was 19 was saving her now. She ran across the frozen ground with her ankle screaming and her breath coming in white clouds, and the net launcher tracking toward Alaric's position, and she closed the distance to 50 yards, 40, 30. "Put it down," she said. Her voice cut across the field. The hunter with the launcher turned. He was a large man, dressed for weather, with the professional blankness of someone who had done dangerous things for long enough that they had stopped registering as dangerous. He looked at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere with a rifle and an ankle that was clearly causing her pain, and he made the calculation that large, professionally blank men always made when they encountered an obstacle that appeared smaller than them. He made it wrong. "This isn't your business," he said. "He is my husband," Elena said. "Everything he is my business." "Lady, the launcher," she said. "On the ground, now, or I will make a decision that you will not walk away from, and I will make it without hesitation, and I will live with the consequences without losing a single night's sleep." She held his gaze across the rifle sights with the absolute steadiness of a woman who had spent 27 years developing the specific kind of certainty that came from having nothing left to prove to anyone. "I know you think I'm an obstacle. I am asking you to reconsider that assessment." Something in the hunter's professional blankness cracked, not because she was frightening in the way that the enormous wolf 20 yards behind her was frightening, but because there was a quality in her eyes, that clear, unflinching quality, that communicated something that could not be faked. She meant every single word. The launcher went to the ground. The second hunter moved, not toward her, toward the tree line, which was either retreat or a flanking maneuver, and Elena tracked him with the rifle for 2 full seconds before she identified it as retreat. The third hunter had already gone. The fourth was backing away with his hands visible, which was as close to a formal surrender as the situation was going to offer. Behind her, she heard the sound of the fighting change. She turned. The 5 remaining rogues were on the ground. All of them. Not dead. She could see the rise and fall of ribs, the dazed, disoriented movement of animals that had been overpowered so completely and so quickly that their nervous systems were still attempting to process what had happened. Alaric stood in the center of the frozen field, and he was still, and the wave of his presence rolled outward from him like heat from a forge, warm and enormous and total, and the rogues on the ground felt it and pressed their muzzles into the snow and did not try to rise. The night went quiet. Not the terrible held-breath silence of before. A different kind. The silence that came after, when the thing that had been feared was past, and the damage was known, and the world was in the process of recalibrating itself. Elena lowered the rifle. Her ankle was very unhappy. She became aware of this now that the immediate emergency had receded, became aware of it in the full and unpleasant way that injuries made themselves known once the adrenaline that had been suppressing them eased. She shifted her weight carefully to her right foot. She heard movement behind her and turned, ready, and found Harrow coming over the embankment. No West Side second team then, or if there had been, the shot Harrow had described to warn her had been unnecessary, followed by Thomas Caldwell, who had apparently decided that being one of the first over the fence line was the most direct available route toward addressing the situation he found himself in, morally speaking. Thomas stopped when he saw the field, stopped and looked at the wolves on the ground and the retreating hunters and the enormous silver-gray wolf standing silent and motionless in the center of it all. And his face underwent a series of rapid transformations that would have been fascinating to observe if Elena had had more patience for them at that moment. She watched Alaric begin to shift back. The transformation was not slow or dramatic. It was quick, almost businesslike, the way professionals move through the things they were required to do. And within moments, the man was standing where the wolf had been, in the cold and the dark, coatless and breathing hard, and with a cut along his left forearm that hadn't been there before. He crossed the frozen ground to her. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and they were the same eyes, exactly the same, the wolf's eyes and the man's eyes. She understood now why they had always seemed so old. And he looked at the rifle in her hands and the way she was standing and the specific angle of her left foot. "Your ankle," he said. "It's fine." "It's not." "It'll hold long enough." She lowered the rifle. The hunters. 3 retreated. 1. She glanced back. The man with the launcher was still there, sitting on the frozen ground with his hands flat on his knees, having apparently decided that the best available option was stillness. 1 didn't. Alaric looked at the sitting hunter for a moment with an expression that was not quite what she would have expected, not satisfaction, not victory, but the particular focused attention of a man who had just found the thread he had been looking for. "He's a handler," he said quietly. "One of the network's operations coordinators. If he's here personally, it means we're close to the top." He paused. "This is the break I've been waiting for." "Then you should probably not let him leave," Elena said. "No," Alaric agreed. "I probably shouldn't." He walked toward the sitting hunter with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and the hunter watched him come and did not run, because there was nowhere to run on open, frozen ground with an alpha king between you and the tree line. And whatever else this man was, he appeared to understand when a situation had been fully resolved. Behind Elena, on the embankment, more people were appearing. Harrow had apparently called back to the village when he crossed the fence, because there were faces she recognized. Pike, and behind him more of the village's men, and behind them, making her way with the careful determination of a woman navigating unfamiliar territory, Nora Vane. And at the back of the group, moving more slowly, with an expression that Elena could not quite read from this distance, but that looked nothing like the geological landscape of the past 20 years, Marta Whitmore. They had all come out. They had come out because the barking had stopped and the fighting sounds had stopped, and whatever they had been bracing for had apparently been resolved, and because the people of Black Hollow were, when it came down to it, the specific kind of stubborn that refused to wait inside when something important was happening outside. Pike came to stand beside Elena. He looked at the field, the wolves on the ground. Alaric crouched beside the sitting hunter, the retreating forms of the other hunters disappearing into the tree line. He stood there for a long time without saying anything, which was, for Pike, a significant event. "Well," he said finally. "Yes," Elena agreed. "I owe you." He stopped, started again. "This village owes you an apology. Significant. Multiple." He paused. "I don't know that we know how to do that properly." "You don't have to do it right now," Elena said. "You can start by keeping those men on the ground until my husband has finished with his interrogation." Pike looked at the wolves on the snow. "Are they? They'll be all right." She was not entirely certain of this, but she was sufficiently confident to say it. "They're not killers, most of them. They were driven to this." Pike nodded slowly. He called back to the men behind him, and 3 of the village's best hunters moved out to secure the perimeter, and the operation proceeded with the functional competence that Black Hollow was, in fact, capable of when it was pointed in the right direction. Dawn was 2 hours away when the immediate crisis had been fully contained and the village had begun the slow, disorienting process of returning to something that resembled normalcy. The rogues had been secured, not harmed further, kept in the mill's outer yard, which was the only space large enough and secure enough to hold them, while Alaric worked through the situation. The captured hunter was in the blacksmith's under guard,
providing information with the resigned cooperation of a man who had assessed his situation and concluded that cooperation was the most logical available response. Two of the other hunters had been tracked and caught by Harrow and his people in the forest east of the village. The fourth had gotten clear, a gap in the coverage that Alaric absorbed with the focused dissatisfaction of a man who held himself to a standard that did not include letting anyone get clear. The village gathered in the community hall, as much from the collective need to be in the same room as from any organized decision. Fires were built up. Someone produced a pot of something hot, and cups were passed around with the automatic hospitality that communities extended to each other in the aftermath of shared crisis. Because shared crisis, whatever else it did, reminded people that they were in the same place together. Elena sat on a bench near the back wall with her left boot off, and her ankle wrapped with a strip of cloth that Harrow's wife, who had more practical medical experience than anyone else in the village, had applied with efficient, kind hands. The ankle was badly sprained but not broken. This was, relative to what the night could have produced, an excellent outcome. Alaric sat beside her. He had found his coat. Someone had brought it out from the house, she realized, which meant that someone had gone to the Whitmore property and returned with it, which was its own small and unremarked-upon revolution. He had the cut on his arm cleaned and dressed, and he sat with his forearms on his knees in the posture of a man who had been running on full operational capacity for hours and was beginning, carefully, to let the tension down. "Your people," Elena said, "the ones who are coming." 2 days, he said. "Maybe less now. I sent a signal before midnight." "The conspiracy. The handler in the blacksmiths. Is it enough?" "More than enough." His voice had the quiet satisfaction of something long sought, finally obtained. "He knows the entire network, every staging point, every handler, every hunter in the operation. With that information and the physical evidence we've gathered here," he paused. "It ends. This version of it ends." Elena looked at the hall around them, at her neighbors who had spent the last several hours moving from fear to action to the particular subdued intensity of people reassessing everything they thought they knew. Thomas Caldwell was sitting across the room, not looking at her, but with a quality of stillness that suggested he was very aware of her presence and was engaged in some kind of internal accounting that she had no interest in rushing him through. Agnes Caldwell was 3 benches forward, her hands wrapped around a cup, and when she caught Elena's eyes, she did not look away, held the gaze for a moment, and gave a small, precise nod that communicated something far more complex than its simplicity suggested. Nora Vane had found her way to Elena's side sometime in the last hour and was sitting on the floor beside the bench, leaning against the wall, asleep, which was the most eloquent statement available about how the night had resolved itself. And at the far end of the hall near the fire, Marta Whitmore sat with old Werner, who had been retrieved from the root cellar once it was safe and was now installed in the warmest spot in the room with a cup of tea and the slightly dazed dignity of a very old man who had been through several things in one night. Marta was talking to him in a low voice, and whatever she was saying, it was making Werner nod, and she looked from across the hall like someone Elena had known a very long time ago, before grief and resentment had done what they had done. Elena watched her for a moment. "Your mother," Alaric said quietly, following her gaze. "My mother." "She was the one who organized the children to the root cellar," he said, "while you were doing everything else. Harrow told me." Elena said nothing for a moment. Then, "She used to be like that, before my father died." She paused. "She forgot." Alaric looked at her. "People forget things sometimes," he said. "And then something happens, and they remember." Elena looked at her hands, at the calluses from years of axe handles and fence posts and water buckets and all the practical labor of survival, at the strip of old leather she still sometimes used to tie back her hair, so habitual she barely noticed it anymore, at the ring on her left hand, plain silver. The only thing Alaric had been wearing that matched the scale of what he actually was. A simple silver ring that she had thought was the only luxury a drifter allowed himself, and now understood was probably an artifact of the northern royal court, worn every day in a cold barn in a frontier village, because he had never taken it off. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had come to know, not avoidance, but honest consideration. "My people arrive. We process what was captured here. The network is dismantled. He paused. And then I go north. He looked at her carefully. We go north. Elena felt the weight of those two words, we go north, and felt the world contained in them. The northern territories, the mountain packs, the Valen coast, the royal capital, with its court and its politics, and the vast complex machinery of a kingdom that had been operating without its king for 4 months while its king fixed fence posts in a frontier village. The size of it was genuinely staggering. I'm going to need considerably better clothes, she said. Something in Alaric's face, in the king's face, broke into something that was entirely, simply the man she had chosen. He laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a king's laugh, a real one, low and sudden and startled out of him, and it transformed his face into something so unexpectedly unguarded that several people nearby looked over in surprise. Yes, he said when he had recovered. Among other things. I don't know how to be a queen, Elena said. The most honest thing she had said in weeks, and she said it the way she said everything, directly, without drama, because it was true, and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. You've been managing Black Hollow during a coordinated attack with a sprained ankle, he said. You organized the defense of this village better in 40 minutes than most of my generals manage in a week. He looked at her with those eyes, that clear and ancient and specific regard. You know how to be everything a queen needs to be. The rest is just learning which fork to use at formal dinners. How many forks are there? At formal dinners? He considered. More than is strictly necessary. She almost smiled. The hall was warm, and her ankle ached, and somewhere north of the ridge the captured thread of a 2-year conspiracy was being slowly unraveled. And in 2 days, maybe less, the world was going to arrive in Black Hollow and change everything again. And this time the change would be irrevocable and enormous and final. But right now, in this moment, in this hall, with Nora Vane asleep on the floor, and the fire working steadily, and the village of Black Hollow doing what it had always done, surviving, together, through the collective stubbornness that was its most fundamental characteristic, Elena felt, with the particular clarity that came to her in moments of genuine consequence, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had chosen this. She had chosen him before she knew what he was. She had stood in a barn at the end of the world and looked across a hay-strewn aisle at a man who looked at her like she was interesting, and she had made a decision with her whole self, with nothing held back, and the world had turned out to be larger and stranger and more full of consequence than she had known, and she had not flinched. She was not going to flinch now. Outside, the winter dark was beginning, just beginning, at its furthest eastern edge, to consider the possibility of morning, not dawn yet, not even close, but the suggestion of it, barely perceptible, in the quality of the black above the ridge. Elena leaned back against the wall. Her shoulder found Alaric's arm and stayed there. She felt him go very still for a moment, the way he sometimes went still when she did something he hadn't anticipated, and then she felt him settle. The specific quality of a person setting down weight they have been carrying for a very long time. They sat in the warmth and the quiet, and the village breathed around them, and the first long night began its slow turn towards something that, while it could not yet be called morning, was no longer entirely dark. The reckoning, when it came, would come in daylight. And Elena Whitmore, who would be, before the week was out, a name known in every corner of the Northern Territories, was ready. The reckoning came, as Elena had known it would, in the full light of morning. She had not slept. She had rested. There was a difference, a distinction she had learned young, between the complete surrender of sleep and the lighter, more vigilant state of a body that was allowing itself to recover without releasing its hold on awareness. She had sat against the wall of the community hall with Alaric's arm beneath her shoulder and Nora Vane asleep on the floor beside her feet, and she had let the hall's warmth and the sounds of her neighbors settle into her like something she was memorizing, because some part of her understood that this specific configuration of things, this particular version of Black Hollow, with its familiar faces and its familiar cruelties and its familiar stubbornness, was ending, and what came after would be different in ways she could not yet fully see. Dawn arrived with the particular clarity of deep winter mornings, when the cold had scoured the air overnight and left it so clean and sharp that the light seemed to cut rather than illuminate. The hall began to stir. Children woke first, as children always did, with the quick recovery of the young from anything short of genuine catastrophe, and their voices were the first ordinary sounds of the new day. Asking for breakfast, asking what had happened, asking with the relentless practical curiosity of the very young why there were large wolves in the mill yard. Elena stood, tested her ankle carefully, found it bearable, and went to help with the breakfast. This was the choice that would be remarked upon later by people who had been there, not by Elena herself, who never discussed it, because to her it had not been a choice in any meaningful sense. It had simply been the thing that needed doing. There were people in the hall who hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. There were children who were frightened and needed the reassurance of ordinary things, and the most powerful ordinary thing available was food. So Elena went to the kitchen corner of the hall, and she made breakfast out of what was available, and Marta Whitmore appeared beside her without being asked and began to help, and the two of them worked together in the same kitchen space for the first time in years without speaking, because the conversation they needed to have was too large for the morning, and both of them knew it. It was Marta who spoke first, eventually. Not an apology. Not yet. Not in words. She picked up the ladle and stirred the pot and said, without looking at her daughter, "He fixed the east wall of the barn." "Yes," Elena said. "I noticed, in October. I didn't say anything." "I know." "I should have—" Marta stopped. The ladle moved in the pot. "I should have said something then." Elena looked at the side of her mother's face, at the geography of it, carved by years she had been present for and years she hadn't fully understood, and at the crack that had developed in it overnight, the crack through which something genuine was showing. "We'll have time," Elena said. "Later. There will be time." Marta nodded once, sharp and short, in the way of a woman who was operating at the edge of her available emotional vocabulary and knew it. Then she ladled out the first portion and called to the nearest group of children, and they came, and the morning continued. The royal guard arrived before noon. Elena heard them from the mill yard, where she had been doing something that had surprised every person who witnessed it, talking to the rogues. Not all of them were capable of conversation. 3 of the 8 were too far gone. The madness that came from extended rogue existence had progressed past the point where coherent communication was possible, and they lay in the yard with the specific stillness of creatures that had been overpowered so completely that their systems had simply stopped. They would need the kind of care that Black Hollow could not provide, and Alaric had already determined they would be transported north to the pack healers who specialized in rogue rehabilitation. But the other 5 were something different. They were young. That was the first thing Elena had noticed, slipping out to the mill yard in the early morning while most of the village was still inside. Young and thin and marked with the particular physical evidence of prolonged stress, scarring that had healed badly, the hollow quality of animals that hadn't eaten well in months, the flinching alertness of creatures that had lived for too long in a state of constant threat. They were not the monsters the village had been bracing for. They were the damaged remnants of something that had once been healthy and had been deliberately, systematically destroyed. She had sat down on the frozen ground near them, carefully, at a distance that respected their boundaries, and simply been present, not speaking at first, just there, in the cold, in the morning light, with the patient quality she brought to all difficult things. The largest of them, a dark-coated wolf with one ear that hadn't healed straight, had looked at her for a long time. Then, with the cautious deliberateness of a creature deciding to take a risk it wasn't sure of, it had moved 6 inches closer. She had stayed very still. 6 inches became a foot became 3 feet, and then the dark wolf was close enough that she could have touched it, and it put its massive head down on its forepaws and exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release something it had been holding for a very long time. "I know," Elena said softly. "I know it's been a long time." She was still there, 2 hours later, with 3 of the 5 wolves in varying degrees of proximity to her, when she heard the horns. She recognized them not from experience. She had never heard a royal horn call in her life, but from the quality of the sound itself, which had a formality and a resonance that separated it immediately from anything produced by frontier necessity. She stood carefully, not disturbing the wolves more than she could help, and walked back to the village perimeter. The Royal Guard of the Northern Territories rode into Black Hollow in a formation that was simultaneously practical and magnificent. 40 riders, armed and armored in silver and deep gray, moving with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had been riding together long enough that the horses' movements were perfectly matched. At their head, a tall woman on a black horse with close-cropped silver hair and a face that suggested she had spent the last 4 months in a controlled state of professional fury. Behind the column, support wagons, medical equipment, supplies. They had come prepared for an aftermath. The village, which had spent the night recovering from one seismic event, found itself confronting a second one. People poured out of the hall and the mill and the blacksmiths and the root cellars, and they stood on the main road of Black Hollow and watched 40 royal soldiers ride into their settlement, and the scale of what had been living in their midst for 4 months crashed over them with the full weight of delayed comprehension. Alaric was at the gate when the lead rider reached it. The tall woman on the black horse looked down at him. Something moved in her face, a rapid, complex passage of emotions that she controlled immediately and almost entirely, leaving only the faintest residue of relief. "My king," she said, "you look terrible." "Commander Vey," Alaric said, "you're a day early. You sent a signal that indicated a coordinated assault on a civilian settlement." She swung down from the horse with the practiced ease of a person who spent as much time mounted as unmounted. "We rode through the night." She looked at the cut on his arm, at the mud still on his coat, at the general evidence of a man who had spent the night doing things that his royal guard was supposed to be present for. "I notice the village is still standing." "It is." "I notice you are also still standing." "Also, yes." "And the network?" "Handler in the blacksmiths. 2 field operatives secured, evidence enough to dismantle the entire operation." He paused. "And 8 rogues who need transport to the northern healers." Commander Vey absorbed this. Her gaze traveled from Alaric to the hall to the mill yard to the assembled residents of Black Hollow, who were watching this exchange with the fascinated, slightly overwhelmed attention of people who had comprehensively exceeded their context. Then her gaze found Elena, standing at the edge of the gathering, ankles still wrapped, dark hair loose from its leather tie, wearing the same clothes she had worn through the entire night. The commander looked at Elena for a long moment with an assessment so thorough it was almost physical. Then she looked back at Alaric. "This is her," she said. Not a question. "Yes." Vey looked at Elena again. "She held the perimeter against the hunters." "She held it alone," Alaric said, "and then organized the village's defense in under an hour, and managed civilian evacuation while managing the fence line, with a sprained ankle, in a hard freeze, in a settlement that has spent the last 4 months treating her as a social liability." Said Commander Vey, which was an extremely compressed sound that contained within it approximately a full paragraph's worth of assessment and revision. She crossed the distance to Elena and stopped 3 feet away and looked at her directly. "I'm Vey," she said. "I command the King's Guard." "Elena Whitmore," Elena said. "I run a small farm on the east end of the village." "Not anymore," Vey said. And there was something in her voice that was not the warmth of an easy compliment, but the harder, more durable acknowledgement of a professional for competence she respected. "My king speaks highly of you." "He has questionable judgment in some matters," Elena said. "This may be one of them." Something that might, in a different face, have been a smile passed through Commander Vey's expression. "I begin to see," she said, "why he stayed 4 months." The formal process took 3 days. Elena had expected bureaucracy. She was not naive about the machinery of institutions. Even institutions she had never directly encountered. But the specific character of Royal Northern Territory bureaucracy was something she had to learn in real time, and she learned it the way she learned everything, which was by paying very close attention to how it worked and then finding the most efficient path through it. Alaric's people were thorough. The hunter and the blacksmiths talked, and what he said was corroborated by the physical evidence gathered from the camp Alaric had found north of the ridge and from the 2 captured field operatives. And by the end of the first day, the picture of the conspiracy was complete enough that Commander Vey, sitting with her maps in the community hall that had been temporarily converted into a field operations center, could say with confidence that the network had no surviving operational capability in the northern frontier territories. It was not a small thing. 2 years of work. Families that had disappeared. Pack settlements that had been destroyed. The Orvine family, whose fate was confirmed on the second day with a grim precision that sat heavily in Elena's chest. Not guilt, because she had not been in a position to prevent it, but the particular weight of witnesses, of people who learned what had happened and were now responsible for knowing. She held that knowledge and did not set it down. This, she had come to understand, was part of what it meant to be the person beside the person responsible, not the performance of feeling, but the genuine weight of it, carried and integrated rather than managed and suppressed. On the second day, the village held a formal assembly. It was not Alaric who requested it. It was Pike, who came to Elena the morning of the second day with the specific expression of a man who has been doing moral accounting and has arrived at a balance sheet that requires action. "The village needs to say something," he said. "Formally. Publicly." He paused. "I think it should be you he addresses it to, not me." "It doesn't need to be formal," Elena said. "It does," Pike said with a quiet firmness that surprised her. "You deserved better from us for 27 years, Mrs. Hale. The least we can do is say so out loud in the square, with everyone watching." He met her gaze. "The same way we said the wrong things out loud, in the square, with everyone watching." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. The square was full again. The same 230 residents, plus 40 royal soldiers standing at respectful parade positions along the perimeter. A detail that Commander Vey had organized without being asked, and that Elena had understood immediately as a deliberate choice, the King's Guard witnessing the village's public accounting. Pike stood at the center and spoke without notes, which was how she knew he had been thinking about what he wanted to say for the entire previous day. He spoke about the frontier and about what it did to communities, the way fear accumulated, the way fear found outlets, the way those outlets were almost always the people least able to defend themselves against them. He spoke about Elena specifically, not in vague generalities, but with the naming of specific incidents and specific moments and specific failures of the community's collective moral imagination. He did not use the word sorry. He used language that was harder and more specific and more honest. We were wrong. We did harm. We owe a debt that cannot be fully repaid. The square was very quiet. Agnes Caldwell stood up next without being invited or organized to do so, and Elena suspected that this had been planned between Pike and Agnes the previous evening, because Agnes spoke with the same quality of prepared honesty, not performed contrition but genuine reckoning, the kind that acknowledged specific harm without self-dramatizing it, which was actually harder. She looked directly at Elena while she spoke. She did not look away. Thomas Caldwell did not speak publicly, but he found Elena afterward on the edge of the square, and he stood in front of her with his hat in his hands. The same gesture, she noticed, that Rowan Hale had stood with in her barn doorway the very first morning. And he said, "I was unkind to you, consistently, over years. There's no version of this where that's all right." He paused. "I'm sorry." It was a short sentence. It was the right sentence. "I know," Elena said, and she let it be enough because she was not a woman who required the extended performance of remorse from people who had genuinely produced the thing itself. She looked for her mother afterward and found her not in the square, but back at the house. The Whitmore house, the house her father had built and her mother had refused to let deteriorate beyond the point where it was no longer structurally his. Marta was in the kitchen, doing what she had apparently been doing all morning, which was cleaning. Not the performative displacement behavior cleaning of a person avoiding something, but the thorough, systematic cleaning of someone who had decided that the house should be in proper order before its occupant left it. Elena stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her mother scrubbing the table with the same methodical attention she had once given to everything before grief had consumed her industry. "You don't have to do that," Elena said. "I know." Marta did not stop scrubbing. "I want to." Elena came into the kitchen and sat at the table that was being cleaned around her, and the two of them were in the same room together with the specific quality of a situation that had passed the point of avoidance and now simply needed to be inhabited. I wanted more for you than this place, Marta said eventually, not looking up from the table. That's what I kept telling myself. That I was hard on you because I wanted more for you, because I didn't want you to end up. She stopped.
Like you, Elena said, gently. Like me, Marta confirmed. The scrubbing slowed, stopped. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. And then you married a man who had nothing, and all I could see was everything I'd warned you against, everything I'd been afraid of. Her jaw worked. I couldn't see. You couldn't see him, Elena said. I know. I couldn't see you. Marta looked up then, and her eyes were bright in the way that eyes became bright when a person was operating at the absolute limit of what they could contain. I hadn't been able to see you for a long time. I'd been looking at everything I was afraid of and calling it you, and that was... She stopped. The word that followed was quiet. Wrong. Elena looked at her mother.
At the woman who had once been someone else, someone harder-edged and sharper and more fully alive, before the drinking and the dying and the long, slow grind of a frontier life that had asked more than she had agreed to give. At the woman who was still there, it turned out, under the geological accumulation of resentment, just buried. Come north, Elena said. Marta blinked. When we go, come with us. Elena held her mother's gaze steadily. Not forever, if you don't want. You can always come back. But come. See what it is. See what I... She stopped, chose the words carefully. See what my life is going to be. I want you to see it. The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. Elena, her mother said. Her voice had lost all of its familiar configurations. The contempt and the disappointment and the performative grief. What was left sounded younger, more uncertain, more real. Why would you want me there? After everything I... Because you're my mother, Elena said simply. And I only have one. And I'm not interested in spending the rest of my life defined by the worst version of the relationship we had. She paused. Are you? Marta Whitmore put her hands over her face. Her shoulders moved once, in a single sharp shudder, the kind that had nothing to do with cold. And then she took a breath and straightened her back and put her hands back on the table and looked at her daughter with eyes that were bright and cleared and entirely, nakedly open. No, she said. Then come north, Elena said. The morning of the third day, Elena Whitmore walked through Black Hollow for the last time as a resident. She had not packed much. She had never had much to pack. 2 changes of clothes, both practical. The leather strip she used for her hair, which she put in her pocket because it had been with her for 15 years, and she saw no reason to change that now. The mended boot with the resoled heel. A single book she had kept through lean years by virtue of the stubbornness that was her primary defining characteristic. She went to the barn. Margot was waiting, had been waiting with the patient attentiveness she always had, dark eyes steady and large ears forward. Elena put her hand on the horse's neck and stood there for a moment in the specific silence of the barn, which smelled of hay and cold and the particular warmth of living animals, and she let herself feel the full weight of the leaving. She had been born 40 yards from this spot. She had spent 27 years within walking distance of it. Every callus on her hands had been earned on this ground, and the ground knew the weight of her footsteps, the way ground knew the things that had walked it for a long time. All right, she said, to the barn, to herself, to the life she was closing the door on. All right. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Alaric stood in the doorway. Not a king right now, or rather, the king and the man so fully integrated that the distinction had become irrelevant. He was wearing clothes that were still frontier clothes, still the practical worn garments of the months they had spent here, because he had said he would change when they reached the first way station north, and he had meant it. He looked like himself. He looked like the man who had fixed the fence posts and the hen house and the east wall of the barn, and who had sat across from her in this building and looked at her like she was interesting. Ready? He said. She looked around the barn one more time. At the east wall she had retimbered, at the roof she had shingled, at the water trough, frozen solid and already broken through for the morning's feeding, because she had broken it through before anything else today from pure habit. Yes, she said. They walked out together. The procession that left Black Hollow that morning was not what the village had imagined, in the various imaginings of the past 3 days. It was not ceremonial, not formal, not staged for effect. It was simply 40 soldiers and 2 wagons, and Margot and a small group of civilians, moving north on the road that ran along the creek and then up through the ridge pass that opened onto the vast, snow-covered territory beyond. Elena walked to the edge of the village at the head of the column, and she stopped once, just once, and turned to look back at Black Hollow. The entire village had come out to see them go. All 230 residents, standing on both sides of the main road, and they were quiet in the way that people were quiet when they were feeling something large and didn't know what to call it. She looked at them, at the faces she had known her entire life. The ones that had been kind, the ones that had been cruel, the ones that had been indifferent, which was its own kind of cruelty, and the ones that had been so absorbed in their own survival that they had simply not had the resources to see her clearly. She looked at Nora Vane, who was crying openly and had apparently decided to be entirely unconcerned about it. At Harrow, whose frontier stoicism had not entirely survived the events of the last 3 days and showed it. At Dorothy Marsh, whose expression was a complicated compound of chagrin and something that might, at a generous reading, be described as pride. At Agnes Caldwell, who met her gaze and did not look away, and gave the same precise small nod she had given in the hall on the night of the attack, but larger this time, and with nothing ambiguous in it. At Thomas Caldwell, who had managed to find somewhere else to look, but was very clearly present, which was its own acknowledgement. And at the very front of the crowd, having walked to the front of the crowd with the quiet determination of a woman who had decided she was going to do something and was doing it, Marta Whitmore. Her coat was on. Her bag, small and carefully packed, was at her feet. She had taken Elena at her word without elaboration and had been ready at dawn. Elena looked at her mother. Her mother looked back at her. Something passed between them. Not absolution, because that was not a single moment's work, and they both knew it, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of 2 people who had hurt each other and been hurt by each other and were choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to continue toward each other anyway. Elena held out her hand. Marta picked up her bag. She walked forward. She took her daughter's hand. They walked north together. The northern capital was called Valin, and it rose at the edge of the mountain range that formed the territorial boundary of the northern Pax, like something that had been argued into existence rather than built. Massive stone walls that had been added to and modified by successive generations until the original structure was barely visible beneath the accumulated weight of centuries, towers that caught the winter light and threw it back in shards. And at the center of it all, the Great Hall of the Alpha King, which had stood for 400 years and looked as if it intended to stand for 400 more. Elena saw it for the first time as they came through the last mountain pass on the 6th day of riding, and she sat on the horse she had been given. Margot, naturally, who had been doing the entire journey with the air of an animal who had suspected something like this was coming. And she looked at the thing she was riding toward and was, for one of the very few times in her life, genuinely speechless. "It's large," she said finally. "Yes," Alaric said beside her. "You live there." "We live there." She looked at him. "Are there a lot of people inside who are going to assess me and find me lacking?" "Undoubtedly." "Nobles." "A considerable number of them, yes." "Who are used to a certain kind of queen?" "Who are used to no queen at all," he said, "since the position has been vacant for my entire reign." He paused. "What they're expecting and what they're getting are 2 different things. I have found, in my experience, that people adjust to reality faster than they adjust to their expectations of it." He looked at her steadily. "And you, Elena, are very real." She looked at the city for another moment, at the towers catching the winter light, at the gates, which were open. Had been thrown open, she realized, as the first outriders had gone ahead to announce the king's return, and at the figures visible even from this distance on the walls and in the gatehouse, looking toward the pass. Waiting. She thought about the barn in Black Hollow, about the water buckets and the frozen trough and the east wall she had timbered herself because no one else was going to do it. She thought about what Alaric had said in the warmth of the community hall after the battle, about most of what a queen needed to be, about forks. She thought about what she knew, what she was actually, practically, demonstrably good at, assessing situations clearly, making decisions under pressure, understanding what people needed and finding the most efficient path to providing it, managing resources, building things that held, standing in the middle of a situation that wanted to grind her down and refusing, on fundamental principle, to be ground. She thought about 27 years of being called a burden, a nothing, a desperate woman who would accept any scraps offered her, and she thought about all the things she had built with her own hands during those 27 years while being called those things, and she thought, let them try. All right, Elena Whitmore said, let's go. The months that followed were not simple. Elena had never expected them to be, and that expectation, or rather the absence of a naive one, turned out to be among her most significant assets. She had arrived in Valen without pretension about what she knew and without apology for what she didn't, and she had applied herself to the learning with the same focused, practical intensity she had applied to every other difficult thing in her life. She was not a natural courtier. She never became one. The formal language, the elaborate protocols, the intricate social performances of the nobility, these she learned because she needed to know them, not because she valued them, and the people who attempted to use her unfamiliarity as a lever against her quickly discovered that she was not embarrassed by it in the way they had expected. She was simply unimpressed by it, which was significantly more destabilizing. What she was, unmistakably and from the first week, was effective. The Northern Territories were not a peaceful kingdom. They were a complex, fractured collection of packed territories and human settlements and frontier communities held together by the authority of the Alpha King and by the network of obligations and alliances that authority maintained. They had been without a Luna, without the specific role of the king's bonded partner, which in pack culture carried its own distinct authority and function, for the entirety of Alaric's reign. The absence had been managed. It had not been solved. Elena understood the frontier. She understood survival. She understood what communities needed when they were frightened and resource-poor and held together by stubbornness rather than comfort. These were not things she had learned from books or from formal instruction. They were things she had built into her body over 27 years of actual practice, and they translated. The first time she sat in on a formal territorial council, 3 weeks after their arrival, still learning the names of the lords and pack alphas assembled around the table, still getting a feel for the landscape of the politics. She had listened for 2 hours and then asked one question that reframed the entire dispute under discussion in a way that produced a resolution within the hour. The table had gone quiet in the particular way of people who had been handed something they hadn't expected from a direction they hadn't been watching. Alaric beside her had said nothing. He had simply looked at her with the expression she knew, the open-handed one, the one without the shield. And in his eyes was something that she was, at this point, familiar enough with to name pride. Simple, clean, unambiguous pride. Commander Vey, who was present at every council and missed nothing, had caught Elena's eye across the table and given her a nod that was, from Vey, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The nobles were harder. The nobles were always going to be harder, because the nobles had more invested in the existing structure and more to lose from a Luna who came from nothing and owed them nothing and had not absorbed their assumptions along with her upbringing. There were those who were openly dismissive, those who were strategically kind in the way that masked assessment, and those, the most dangerous, who were politely, persistently obstructive in ways that were difficult to call out directly. Elena dealt with the dismissive ones by being, consistently, more competent than their dismissal could account for, and by doing it without apparent effort, which was the detail that really bothered them. She dealt with the strategically kind ones by being direct with them in return, which disarmed the strategy entirely and left the kindness, if it was genuine, intact. And the obstructive ones she dealt with through a combination of patience, documentation, and the specific quality that had gotten her through 27 years in Black Hollow, the total implacable refusal to stop. She was not universally loved. She had never expected to be. But she was, within 6 months, genuinely respected by enough of the court and enough of the territorial council that her position had moved from contested to established. And that was a more durable foundation than love, which was fickle, and more valuable than tolerance, which was conditional.
Marta Whitmore spent 3 months at Vallon. She had arrived looking at everything with the expression of a woman who had expected to find things confirming her worst fears and was being comprehensively surprised. She had been given comfortable rooms and left to navigate the capital at her own pace, and she had done so with the cautious, determined methodology of someone who had decided to take the world seriously. She had met Vey, who had looked at her with the direct assessment she gave everything, and then had an hour-long conversation with her that Elena was not privy to and did not ask about. She had walked the market districts and the craftsmen's quarters and the pack settlement at the eastern edge of the city. She had watched her daughter in council and at dinner and in the quiet morning hours when Elena sat with her tea and her maps and planned the day with the same practical focus she had brought to the barn in Black Hollow. On the morning of the 90th day, she came to Elena's rooms with her bag packed. "You're going home," Elena said. "It's my home," Marta said, not defensively, simply with the clarity of a woman who had done the necessary reckoning and come out of it knowing where she belonged. "But I needed to see this." She looked around the rooms, at the north-facing window with its view of the mountain range, at the maps on the table, at the evidence of a life that was large and complicated and real. "I needed to see you in it." "And?" Marta looked at her daughter. The crack in the geological expression had never fully closed, and Elena had stopped expecting it to. Beneath it, now visible in the way things became visible once you knew to look for them, was the woman who had once been capable of this, of looking at her daughter without the filter of fear and resentment, and who was slowly becoming capable of it again. "You're going to be extraordinary," Marta said, simply, without qualification or performance. Elena looked at her mother for a long, quiet moment. "I know," she said, not from arrogance, from the same place she had known everything, the clear, unfiltered place that saw things as they were. She had always known. She had been told otherwise for so long that the knowing had been buried, but it had never been destroyed, and now it sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, warm and permanent and entirely her own. She crossed the room and held her mother for a moment, a brief, firm, honest embrace, without the complicated weight of all the years in it, just the simple fact of them standing in the same place at the same time, choosing toward each other. And then she let go. "Come back in spring," she said. "I'll come back in spring," Marta agreed. She left at noon. The day Elena Whitmore was formally recognized as Luna Queen of the Northern Territories was the first day of the new year, and it was attended by every Pack Alpha and Territorial Lord and Frontier representative in the Northern lands, because Alaric had insisted on a ceremony that was genuine rather than ceremonial, and genuine meant witnessed. She stood in the great hall of Vallon in a dress that was, admittedly, significantly better than anything she had owned in Black Hollow. Dark blue, simply cut, with the silver detail of the Northern Pack standard at the collar and cuffs, and she wore her hair down, which was a choice and was read as one, and she stood straight with the back that had been straight through every humiliation Black Hollow had offered, and she received the formal acknowledgement of a kingdom without flinching, because she had never flinched. The wolves in the hall, and there were many, the room dense with Pack presence, felt what they had first felt in a frontier square in December, the Alpha King's aura, enormous and total, and beside it, something new, something they did not have a precedent for exactly, but that registered in the instinctive way such things always registered, the specific, clear, unshakable quality of a person who knew exactly who they were and had earned that knowledge the hardest possible way. Not power in the wolf sense, something older, something that had nothing to do with bloodlines or hierarchy and everything to do with the particular authority of a person who had been through the fire and come out of it not diminished but clarified. Alaric stood beside her. He had been beside her, in one form or another, in one way or another, since a morning in a barn when he had shown up with an offer to fix fence posts, and she had looked at him with those river water eyes and decided, with the specific stubbornness that defined her, to try. He took her hand. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and in the look between them was every quiet morning and hard night and honest conversation and the specific weight of two people who had chosen each other before the choosing was easy, and had kept choosing each other as it became harder, and had arrived here. In this enormous hall, in this ancient building, at the center of a kingdom that was going to be different now because she was in it. together. The ceremony concluded. The hall held its breath, and then the wolves, one by one, and then all at once, bent their heads. Not to the king, to the Luna, to the woman from Black Hollow who had been called nothing and had turned out to be everything. Elena Whitmore. Luna. Queen of the Northern Territories, daughter of the frontier, the woman they had tried to bury, stood in the hall of her ancestors by choice, with the hand of the man she loved in hers and the weight of a kingdom she intended to carry with both hands and all her strength. And she felt the acknowledgement roll through the room and wash over her, like the first warm wind at the end of a long winter. And she did not cry, because she had cried all her tears a long time ago in a barn where no one was watching. And what she had now, standing here, with all of this, was something entirely beyond tears. She squeezed Alaric's hand. He squeezed back. Outside, through the high windows of the great hall, the first snow of the new year was beginning to fall on Valin, clean and quiet and unhurried, covering the old ground with new white, making the world fresh and still and full of possibility. The woman they had called worthless had come home.